My name's Libby Bischoff, and I'm the Executive Director of the Osher Map Library and Smith Center for Cartographic Education here at the University of Southern Maine. And we are very happy to be in partnership with the Akomawt Educational Initiative this morning and with Maine Historical Society and the Maine Department of Education Social Studies Wing to bring together this workshop on teaching Maine through primary sources. I'm just going to introduce the participants and their organizations briefly, and then we're going to jump right into the first of the presentations. And each presenter will talk a little bit about how they will be handling Q&A. And so our first presenters will be Endawnis Spears and Chris Newell from the Akomawt Educational Initiative. Endawnis is the Director of Programming and Outreach. Chris is the Director of Education. For those of you here in Maine, I think as many of us are, I will also mention in addition to his work with Akomawt, Chris is the new director, still relatively new executive director of the Abbey Museum up in Bar Harbor, which is an unbelievable resource both in person and online for Indigenous history, for the history of Maine, past, present, and moving into the future. They have wonderful educators and excellent programming. So I certainly, if you're not familiar with the Abbey, I'm sure Chris will mention it, but I also just want to make sure that you become familiar with them. Akomawt is dedicated to furthering the knowledge of Native America through innovative learning approaches that are designed to impact how we teach history and contemporary social issues. And I think that intersection is really important and at the center of so much of what we're doing as educators right now, especially as we go back to school in the middle of dual pandemics, right? In the dual pandemic of COVID-19 and of racism in America as we are entering in the midst of an election season. I think contemporary issues are going to be very much on our students' mind and on our own, and those connections between the past and the present seem more important than ever. And Endawnis and Chris will certainly talk more about what they do at Akomawt and how they work with teachers around New England and around the country on this important work. We're delighted to also be joined by Kathleen Newman and Brittany Cook from the Maine Historical Society. Maine Historical Society downtown Portland, Maine on Congress Street, and very much present online through the Maine Memory Network and Maine History Online, which you'll hear more about today. Kathleen is the Manager of Education and Public Programs at Maine Historical, and Brittany is the Bicentennial Education Fellow. And we're also joined by Renee Keul from the Osher Map Library. She is the Cartographic Education Outreach Coordinator, particularly for K through 12, and our Education Outreach Assistant, Sean Martell, is also on with us this morning. And so all of these organizations will be presenting their own take on Maine primary sources and professional development, and to set us first together in this place. And I am sitting personally in Portland, in my office at the Osher Map Library, and I know everyone else is scattered about, but to begin our work with the acknowledgement that wherever we sit in Maine, we sit on Wabanaki territory in the Dawnland, that we are on Indigenous land. As we begin this work, if we can all kind of embrace that notion together, I think it's a significant one, both at Maine's bicentennial and the reckoning with what that means, and always. So with that, I would love to turn it over to Endawnis and Chris.
Thank you, Libby. Good morning, everyone. Yate Shea Endawnis Spears Initiate. Hashkan Hatsohonishle, Ojibwe people, Bashishchin, Tanesani Dishiche, Do Choctaw and Chickasaw people, Dishinele. Hi everyone, I'm Endawnis Spears, and I am yucca fruit strung out in a line clan from the Diné or Navajo people. I'm born for the Ojibwe or Anishinaabe people from White Earth, Minnesota, and I am on my maternal grandfather's side from the Tangled clan, and from my paternal grandfather's side from the Choctaw and Chickasaw people currently in present-day Oklahoma. So I am not originally from where I am beaming into you from. I'm here in Rhode Island, which is the homeland of the Narragansett people, or the people of the Small Point. And my husband is Narragansett, and we have 4 children that we loaded up and carted off to the grandparents' house this morning, and hence the beautiful silence and serene environment that I'm sitting in. And I live here in Rhode Island with my husband and my family. I'm originally from Arizona, which is where my mother's people are from, the Navajo or Dene people. And I'm really honored to be here with you today, excited to start off a series of sessions and discussions that in a way that helps to frame the rest of the work that we're going to do together. So my presentation this morning is really about providing a common starting place around terminology. So if we're going to talk about Indigenous people and communities in a historical lens, or Indigenous people and communities in a contemporary lens, and our favorite in Akomawt is Indigenous people in the future, how do we talk about them? What are the proper terminology that we use to talk about Native people and communities? So that's what we're going to talk about for the next 45 minutes, and hopefully provide you with some language that you can feel confident in using in your classrooms and also in your life outside of the classroom, where you are also educating people and interacting with folks. And for Akomawt, we work with educators in classroom, K through 12 educators. We also work with museums. We started at the Mashantucket Pequot Museum in Mashantucket, Connecticut, which is where Chris and I and our third co-founder, Dr. Jason Mancini, met. And we work in museum spaces as well, and in colleges and universities, to look at how we can incorporate Indigenous perspectives into their work. And these are very different places. They require different tools, approaches, and techniques in each space. But Akomawt, one of our founding principles is that knowledge lives everywhere all the time. It's dynamic. And this concept that knowledge is contained within a museum or a building or a school or a college and university, but it does not live at the grocery store, or it does not live at the kitchen table, or it does not live at the park. These are Western concepts, that knowledge can be siloed within a building, or that knowledge can be siloed within a particular space and doesn't exist outside of that space. No, you carry that knowledge with you everywhere, and you employ it in different ways. And so we believe in Akomawt that all of these forms of knowledge are connected, and we want to work in as many spaces as we possibly can because they intersect with one another. We are not completely restricted to one space all the time. And especially here on Zoom, I'm speaking with all of you. I hope that the knowledge that flows through this conversation here also is diffused through your own communities and conversations for the upcoming year and beyond. So that's just a little bit about what our organization does and what we believe, and how we kind of infuse that into the work that we do. So let's talk about Indigenous terminology. And I'm going to share a couple of slides with you so we can all look at the same thing. 2 things at one time. Here we go. Yes. All right. Okay. Oh no, that was the wrong thing. I'm sorry. I don't want to share with you here. Here we go. Can everyone see that? All right. Awesome. So let's start with one of the most common questions that we get in Akomawt. And that is, what is the appropriate term to refer to Native people? And I should have mentioned this at the beginning. I got kind of caught up in talking about our discussion. I have some time set aside at the end of my presentation for questions. So if you have any questions, just hold on to them for now, and we'll spend about the last 20 minutes or so answering questions, and I will tell you what's easiest for me at that time. So we get this question all the time. What is the proper term for Native people, for Indian people? Is it Native American? Is it American Indian? These two terms are kind of synonymous with one another. They're interchangeable. They are umbrella terms for the over 570 federally recognized tribes in the United States, and they're most commonly used in United States American culture. So these are the terms that most people are familiar with, not even here, but abroad. So, you know, when, I don't know, we'll have to ask Chris later, but when Native people travel abroad, like when I was in South Africa, people would ask me what I was. They could tell I was American, but their most common term that they would understand wasn't even Native American or American Indian, it was actually Red Indian. But these are terms that probably are widely recognized across Europe and here as well. The alternative to these terms, so another umbrella term, is Native people or Indigenous people. And these are terms in the English language that are not tied to the concept of the United States. So you'll notice as I go through my presentation, and perhaps Chris's as well, to please take note of how we utilize different terms in different scenarios. I personally prefer to use the term Native people or Indigenous people because the term Native American and American Indian have the word America in them. And America is a relatively new term, and it is attributed to an Italian cartographer and quote unquote explorer. And so we know that for Native people and Indigenous people here on Turtle Island, that our languages, our cultures, all of those things are older than the concept of America and the arrival of Amerigo Vespucci. So, you'll hear me using the term Native people and Indigenous people quite often. But these, again, are terms in the English language, and they are umbrella terms. And then we have the term Indian. So this one is used for the inhabitants of Turtle Island. And Turtle Island is an English language term that refers to the Americas. And it's the preferred term by some Native people because, for the reason I mentioned before. The term America is assigning ownership to a white male. And so we use the term Turtle Island instead because it refers back to an origin story by the Anishinaabe people about how this land was formed. So that's an English language term that has been adopted by many Native people to refer to this geographic space. So the term Indian is used in federal policy. So it was used in the writing of the Constitution. Federal laws about and for Indigenous people in America is known as federal Indian law. It's also used for legal terminology for Native people. And it's part of, the Declaration of Independence, right? The merciless Indian savages. All of these terms are baked into the systems of nation state here in the United States. So, so that is where you will see the term Indian. You'll also see it, again, in the Indian Child Welfare Act, and any kind of federal policy uses the term Indian to refer to Native people here. And then we always put in this little sentence at the end because for the older generation, so my parents' generation and my grandparents, they used the term Indian as well inside of their houses to kind of refer to all Native people. So that's kind of like a throwback term inside of our homes and communities. I would not advise using that term to refer to Native people in your classrooms or in any official capacity. So which generalized term is the right one? And the answer is none of them. They are, which is like a letdown, like wah wah, because we have all this information and we kind of are understanding the nuance of how these different terms are applied. And yet they are all in the English language. So right away, they are not going to be accurate, and they are all umbrella terms. And so whenever possible, and it is, if you look for the opportunities, it is the possibilities are readily available. When possible, when you are speaking about a specific tribe or region, use the names of the tribes you're speaking about. So earlier today, we heard our land acknowledgement statement to open our session together, and utilizing the term Wabanaki people, Dawnland. These are all terms that refer to a very specific group of people in a very specific place. And so that is what we always encourage our colleagues to do. The term Native American and American Indian can erase the specificity and the diversity of Native people on Turtle Island. So one of my pet peeves is when there is the opportunity to use a specific term, and either out of ignorance or usually it's ignorance for the most part, people will use the term Native American. So here in southern New England, we worked at the Mashantucket Pequot Museum, and the local historical society would send out this information about talks about Native American history and Native American archaeology and artifacts, and they would never use the term Pequot. And I think that that adds to the erasure of saying the word Pequot, of utilizing the accurate term, which is an important part of acknowledging the continued presence of Native people here today. And these words have power. So we have to remember that, that's why we're spending so much time setting up this conversation about terminology and the nuance of using accurate terminology for Native people, because words do have the power to frame something in a way that opens people's minds and students' minds up to asking more questions, to thinking critically about the places that they live and how that relates to the Native people who are there or the Native people who are no longer there. So I think that, this is kind of in the weeds, and this is very specific right away, but it really does, it matters, and it matters for the conversations we'll have going forward. So there's some other common terms for Native people that we want to point out. So the term tribe is an anthropology term for a culturally distinct society. So you'll see this used kind of informally for many Native people. The term nation, and this is a term that you will hear more often used by federally acknowledged and state acknowledged tribes and nations. And so there is this requirement by the United States government to have a nation-to-nation relationship with federally acknowledged tribal nations. And so this particular term is the one that you will see most often used when we're talking about sovereignty, politics, and the assertion of sovereign rights. And then tribal nation combines both. So sometimes you'll see tribal governments use tribe and nation together. We know that a tribe and a nation are two very different things. And so therein lies the work that many Native people are doing to continue to live as people who are bonded together by ties of kinship and language and cosmology, and yet also have the policies and the relationships of a nation. And so because a tribe and a nation are very different, Native people are constantly working to marry those two things in a way that makes sense for the community and the future generations. And then the word community is one that I personally use a lot because it envelops all of that. It encompasses tribe and nation. So it's a social term for all Native people and their families who are living in a space together. So in terms of a nation, you have citizens, and those citizens typically have some kind of documentation that they are a citizen of that nation. So for the United States, maybe we have a social security number or a green card or something, some kind of document or assignment for citizenship. For a tribe, there is no documentation that's required for that particular group, but there are ties of kinship. And kinship is much more amorphous and much more flexible than documented citizenship. So you'll see that the word community kind of includes all of that. So for example, Chris is Passamaquoddy, and he married, I always use him as an example, he married a Mashantucket Pequot woman, and their children are Passamaquoddy and Mashantucket, and they are enrolled Mashantucket, and they live on the Mashantucket Pequot Reservation in Connecticut. And Chris, because he has lived there for many years, he is actually part of that community. So that would include Chris as well. That would include people who are married into the community and have children with members of that community and are part of kind of the social fabric of the community. And so I'll use this as a catch-all term pretty often because it is an easier term to access without kind of the legal ramifications of nation and without having to get too anthropological with tribe. And so both of these spaces are equally important, but I do want to point out that there is that difference there. And so I have some resources, and I wanted to share actually a couple of things before I go. When we're talking about some resources for digging a little bit deeper into terminology, let me find. So I'm sure you are all aware of the nativeland.ca, which is a living map project, and I'll show you here. A living map project that gives a better understanding of how land is understood by Native people. So here we are in Maine, and it shows the overlapping territories and homelands of Native people in a way that does not have the geopolitical borders of nation state, which are oftentimes violently imposed on Indigenous people. And so if you want to utilize this resource, this is a great one, and we point people here all of the time. It's because it is living, you'll have people, Native people adding to it constantly, and there is some features here that are also really helpful that help outline where certain language families are in Turtle Island and what land is affected by treaty. So that is the first resource that I will point you to. And then the second is on our website. We put together a 2-page quick reference guide that covers some of the things that we talked about and a little bit more. So we get into clan and the term band. And this is available on our website as well. So there are a couple of resources that are really useful there. And then, of course, the NMAI's Native Knowledge 360. And I'll be sharing these slides with Renee and Libby. So they have all of the links for if you want to go back and take a look. The Native Northeast portal, which is primary documents about Indigenous people in the Northeast. And it is a really great organization because it's formerly the Yale Indian Papers Project. But they're kind of broadening out to create and sustain relationships with Native communities across New England and the Northeast. So that's a really great resource as well. Our good friend and co-founder, Dr. Jason Mancini, did a lot of work on the Indian Mariners Project, which looks at how Indigenous people during the height of the whaling industry, this is kind of more southern New England, extended their communities and culture and kinship from the land to the sea, and what those processes look like for them. And then, of course, Akomawt did a collaboration with the Leventhal Map Center out of the Boston Public Library that really critically looked at what maps mean as artifacts of colonialism. And we did a lot of work with them. It was an interesting process, and I feel like the product that we created with them reflects that complexity of understanding land. And when you try to translate that into a two-dimensional format, what that leaves out, what that leaves behind. So I'll be sure to share these with Renee and Libby, and they'll be able to share with you as well. So we have some time for questions, and I think that the easiest thing for me personally is to look at the chat, and we already have a couple of questions. Is Turtle Island America or the continent? So Chris, you can help me with the questions if you feel. I always want to give you a chance to chime in if you like, but typically we refer to Turtle Island as North and Central America, but I mean, because it's not defined, because when we look at that map on nativeland.ca, there's so much overlap and there's so much flexibility there. I think when we look at that map of what all of these tribal communities, the land that they shared, I think that kind of flexibility is built into our understanding of geopolitical space as well. So Turtle Island doesn't really have that hard cutoff. I think that it can refer to the entire Americas. And so Chris, what do you think?
So yeah, I'm going to be going to that a little bit in my presentation. I was just going to give kind of a summary of the Sky Woman story and where the idea of Turtle Island came from. And just to say that it's more of a description of the reality that Native people saw. So this, it would have been to Native people the entire world. That was the world as we knew it. So if we tried to transpose that onto modern day times, we would be thinking about it as North and South America.
Thank you, Chris. Good. I'm glad you're going to get into a little bit more about the terms that we use for space as well. So if you have a question, just you can raise your hand maybe in the chat. Can I see that? And I'd be happy to answer any other questions that folks have. I think going back to our understanding of how all of these things are linked to power, you as an educator and the work that you do in framing the way that your students understand the land that they live on. So when they're riding home on the school bus or when they're going places with their family, we really want to take that critical lens and give it to them as a gift to look in the spaces around them, not just in history class or not just when they're on a field trip to a museum or not just in school, but really give that opportunity to our students to think critically about the places where we live, our kind of mundane lives, that these are someone's homeland, and let's learn a little bit more about how we can take action or become actively and civically engaged with our communities. There's so many opportunities to turn this knowledge and this framework into action. Yes, Libby.
I think, endawnis, one of the things sometimes we struggle with as educators, and certainly I teach Maine history and many other things for USM for the past 15 years, is in thinking about terminology and expanding our own knowledge of terminology and use. As educators, when are those moments, those most important moments to take the opportunity to gently correct terminology? How do you find yourself interjecting, or when do you take that moment, you know, when students are speaking, when administrators are speaking.
Right.
I think that some guidance there would be helpful for a lot of us.
Yes, thank you for asking that. And Renee, we just had a similar conversation a couple of weeks ago at Upstander, talking about the challenges of inside of our schools and our organizations, kind of educating our colleagues so that we're all on the same page. I think one of the things that's really super cringeworthy is when an executive director or a principal or a superintendent or someone in this kind of leadership and very visible position uses inaccurate terminology. And so what are the ways that we can provide that knowledge for those that we work with as well? So we're employing this knowledge for our students, or we're employing this knowledge with our visitorship. I'm always kind of thinking about public spaces, but also we want to make this readily available for our colleagues so that our institution or our school is understood as a place of equity. It's kind of like a marker or an indicator of how culturally competent, and also a place of how equitable your school is, if through the leadership and the teachers and through the front of line staff and throughout the organization, you're using the accurate terminology constantly. And so I think that the opportunities are there when you, for if you're educating kind of laterally with your colleagues, the opportunities are there when you can send, this is not like self-promotion, but say this is something that to get you started, because I think our quick reference guide, like the Akomawt quick reference guide, and sending that out in a way that says like, this is with all of the Columbus statues coming down, with all of the mascots being replaced. I mean, our students are going to have questions. Here is a quick reference guide, everybody, on some terminology that you can be sure is accurate or gives you another lens or understanding. And I think this is the reference that we put together for Akomawt is 2 pages long, and intentionally so, because there are dissertations about this. There are lifelong educational journeys that Indigenous scholars and non-Indigenous scholars set out on to break down these terms. But we want to give people that first step into feeling like they can speak about these things in their own classrooms, absent Native people. You know, even if there are no Native people in the room, the conversation should still have the same accurate information. And so I think that is one way. And I think that gets back to what you were saying earlier, Libby, that these are not histories. These are the things that are important to our students and their parents and their families right now. And so this is a great opportunity to kind of insert that as pertinent information you need to know right now. Yeah, that's a really great question. And we had a conversation yesterday. Chris and I were part of a conversation with high school students about anti-mascot work that they're doing, where there's these Indian mascots spread across still in Connecticut and Rhode Island, not so much in Maine. And so what are the factors that go into those changes? And part of that is you have to be able to talk about Native people with the right terminology. Chris, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I wanted to add one thing. Sometimes one of the things that I run into the most is, fear from teachers, the fear of not wanting to just totally get it wrong. And, there's something to be said for that. Showing your vulnerability to your students and the fact that you were likely taught the wrong, bad habits yourself, and you're in the learning process yourself, is actually very, enlightening for the students. It lets them know that, oh, wait, this is not just me that missed this. My teacher's generation missed this. This has been a systemic problem, and this is just being worked on now. And it'll help you get over the fear. It'll allow you to make mistakes without feeling like you have, destroyed the content. And by learning together, you as a teacher and your students learning together, sometimes that shared experience that you have with them bonds you much more closer and gives you the base line vocabulary that you're going to need to be able to have deeper conversations going forward. So please do not be scared, to dive into these topics, even if you don't have a deep base of knowledge in it, because the resources are out there. They have been created and more becoming available. When you can get them native sourced, that's the ones we always point to first. And in the process of learning yourself, if your students could watch you learn, that's actually better off for them in the long run. Because it shows that, we're all human beings. We all sometimes have something to learn. And when it comes to this particular information, it has largely been ignored by the public education system. And this is something we're actively trying to change, especially within the state of Maine. And that's a good thing, that we're making progress towards change. And it's a great example to model for your students.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. I could not agree more that this is the content, but also we get to model what it looks like to be intellectually humble and to gain new information and let it shape our understandings going forward. So thank you so much, Chris. And if there's any, oh yes, we have a question. Sonia?
Sorry, I had to unmute myself. So connected to the terminology, and you said that Native people or Indigenous people is not tied to the concept of the United States. My father, whenever we talk about Indigenous Peoples Day or the word Indigenous people comes up, he'll say, but they're not Indigenous. They were not Indigenous. So how do I explain to him what that means? Like, I can't tell him, well, that's not tied to the concept of the United States. I'm going to need to dig a little bit deeper. And this won't be just for him, but potentially students in the future.
Mm-hmm. So I think that there's a lot of things going on there in that conversation. So this will be very exciting.
And let me be, I don't think he's trying to be disrespectful. He's coming from a place of not being educated about it. And I want to be able to provide him with the information so that he can see what it means. Like, I understand it. I don't need to have the explanation, but I don't know how. And he's very open to understanding. I'm making him sound like this really.
No.
He's not. But I want to be able to help him be even more awesome than he already is.
So can I ask a real quick question? When you say your father doesn't think of Native peoples in the Americas as indigenous, is he referring to the Bering? Oh, I was going to say, is he referring to the Bering Strait theory? Because that's some of the pushback we hear occasionally, is that we all came from Asia, therefore we're not indigenous to this continent, because of that. But I'm just trying to see where he's coming from.
And that may be where he's coming from, thinking that his thinking is there were no people here that existed originally. So therefore indigenous, which in his mind means existing originally, the term doesn't, he prefers the term Native people, or no, he prefers actually first people, the first people. He doesn't he doesn't agree with indigenous. So how do is there an argument for me to help him out with?
When it comes to that, the science of the Bering Strait theory is a theory. That's what we got to remember, is that it's not proven fact. There was, of course, some migration that happened on the Beringia Plain, and there was a corridor that opened up about 12,000 years ago that would have allowed passage from the Beringia Plain down into the southern, through the ice pack to the southern part of North America. But what has happened over the years is various places in archaeology have found sites, what they called the it's a archaeological term, but they call the Clovis cultures, the cultures that are named after the tools that they left behind, and they used to date those at around 10 or 11,000 years old. But some of the places that they've found these sites, they realized that nuclear testing, such as at White Sands and other places, actually affects carbon dating. And when they discovered that, they actually redated some of these sites back as far as 15,000 years. So right there, that shows that there were people here before the opening of the ice passage that would have allowed people to come down from the Beringia Plain. Where were they coming from? Every indigenous culture has its own origin stories. Scientifically, we know that when the ice age was happening, the ocean level was a lot lower, and there were a lot more islands that would have been present in the Pacific, and we know that Pacific cultures have the ability to navigate the world without the use of a compass. And so there was the technology to be able to come here that way. There's theories that there could have been landings in earlier times. In fact, when some of the earliest written accounts of Europeans actually running into Wabanaki peoples, they describe seeing blonde-haired, blue-eyed Wabanaki people, which suggests that Europeans were coming well before any written accounts. But when it comes to our own histories, Wabanaki peoples, we see ourselves in this territory going back 25 to 30,000 years. We actually migrated in from the north. And the more and more science starts to look at its own theory, the more it tends to break its own theory apart about the Bering Strait theory. When you look at linguistics and other things, in even the stories that we share, what they tend to find is that a lot of times the oral histories that have been preserved by tribes are actually more correct than the Bering Strait theory that scientists came up with. That was, the truth for scientists for well over 100 years, which is now being picked apart. So it really depends on how you perceive it. Do you go with the science, which is a theory stage at this point, and base that as your basis for not calling somebody indigenous? Is that what the place you hang your hat on? Or do you look at the oral histories that show that during the ice age our people were living out in what is now the Atlantic Ocean, and then as the sea level came up, we moved back inland again. So we have stories about how the ice age happened, and where we were living in, and science has proved that there were certain areas, pockets on the west coast, and now we're starting to find them in the east coast, off the shore, about 100 miles off the shore, where the ice glaciers did not hit, and people could have lived in those territories. So the more and more science looks into it, the more they tend to agree with our own oral histories. So keep waiting. The longer it goes, the more the Bering Strait theory tends to fall apart. And so that's one of the things I would remind anybody that would say that we're not originally from, number one, we're talking at least 11,000 years ago. So, I don't know, our cultures are born of this land over 11,000 years. We are part of this land. So in that view, to me, we are indigenous, whether you believe in the theory or not. But when it comes to our own origin stories, they tend to match up quite well with the science, the more you pay attention to them.
So you're saying that people did exist here, potentially, in where the ocean is now, and then just had to keep creeping inland. So existed here on Turtle Island, if I'm calling it accurately. Mm-hmm. They existed here, didn't, to hear the word migrate, my dad will still say, if they migrated, they're not indigenous. So that's why he's always first people, because they were the first people to come here. So now I can say, Dad, there's some oral stories that you need to listen to, and they're going to contradict the Little Bering Strait theory. That's what you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah. Our old histories tend to contradict, and then as I said, as science figures it out, they're starting to come around. The problem is that all the archaeological evidence that science would actually need is buried under a mile of ocean.
Right.
So it can't be discovered, discovered.
and Sonia, I think, and I know for Wabanaki people, they have words in their language for mastodon. They have words in their language for saber-toothed cat. I mean, they have words that are older than the species that have gone extinct now. So they've been living, and same is true for our southern New England Algonquin-speaking people have words in their language for now extinct animals, because those relationships in that language developed on the land 11,000 years ago. And I think, you know, if your father is so dedicated to accuracy and so dedicated to the nuance of terminology, I would really encourage him to apply that dedication to understanding that same kind of level of nuance for what Native people call themselves in their own languages. If he wants to be 100% accurate, he can. He can find out not just what the tribe is called on their website, and he can use those terms, but he can also, those terms oftentimes are inaccurate terms in colonizing languages. So when we talk about the term Navajo, that's not an accurate term. Our term, that word was never spoken on this continent until the 1500s. And so prior to that, we called ourselves in our own language, we called ourselves Diné, or the people. And so I would encourage him to take that extra step further and find out what the actual word in their own indigenous languages that Native people called themselves. And then that will get to the very most 100% accurate term that a person can use. So instead of saying Choctaw, he can say Chada, and instead of saying Chickasaw, he can say Chicasha, and instead of saying Ojibwe or Chippewa, he can say Anishinaabe, and he can take that step to really actually apply that same love for accuracy to the languages that Native people use to term themselves. Because, you know, at the end of the day, we do have to consider the power dynamics at play. Who has the power to name? Who has the power to apply what you're going to call another group of people? And so if there is an opportunity for people to gain new information and go to, as we talked about earlier, those indigenously sourced materials that are written by Native people, then there is a chance to get into understanding how those power dynamics are still at play. What do the people who lived here for 11,000 years want to be called? And let's defer to that. Let's exercise some willingness to engage with that conversation. And I think that can sometimes yield a lot of goodwill and community making. And so what does it mean to defer? What does it mean to defer to a group of people whose languages were born here? Our languages and our kinship systems reflect the landscapes we live on. And if that's not indigenous to some people, then I really don't know what else could be, because our understanding of the stars was from the places and locations that we lived on the location on the earth. Our understanding of our relationships with God and our ceremonies and the way that we treat one another, all of that was through the lens of landscape. It's through the lens of a place. And so that informs our actions. It informs, I was just looking at Chris. Chris is always so well put together, and he looks so lovely today. He always has his hair tied back. And that's the way that we wear our hair. You know, we're supposed to tie back our hair. We're never supposed to wear our hair out, because we're supposed to, for us as Diné people, we're supposed to have our hair tied up if we want to have coherent thoughts, which may be why I ramble so much today, because it's just I like to have my hair down. But those things came from an origin. That rule came from an origin story of how our world was created, and that came from a specific place within the four sacred mountains in present-day Arizona and New Mexico, Utah, and Colorado. And so when we talk about like indigenous, like that's what we're referring to. We're referring to the fact that we have an origin story that dictated rules that we live by today that are located in a specific place. And so, that I think that could shed some light on the conversation for anyone who has that question, right? Not just your father, but even our students who want to learn more about the term. Yeah, thank you for asking that.
I have a question, if you can help me put something into perspective. And so my family and I, we took a trip to learn more about the Hopi peoples, and we were talking about the history of the Hopi and how they had come from South America. If I'm remembering, this was like 4 years ago, so I apologize if I'm getting it inaccurate. But so from an American perspective, from a modern day American perspective, I'm thinking, okay, so that is a different continent, and you did travel through Central America, and then you came into North America. But understanding it from the perspective of Turtle Island, it's not much different than the fact that I'm a native Washingtonian and am now living in Maine. I don't consider myself not an American because I moved from Washington to Maine. I look at that as migration, but I don't look at that as I've completely changed my something more than location, but I can't think of the word right now. So is it the fact that if you're looking at it from a cultural perspective and you're looking at it from Turtle Island, then you would be indigenous to this place regardless of where you started. But if you're looking at it from a modern day perspective where we look at geopolitical borders, then migration is easier to culturally understand, though not necessarily accurate. Does that make sense? Am I getting it? Or am I off?
I think I understand what you're saying. And I think that what this conversation here that we've had for the last few minutes, and the conversations when your students or when people in your life have questions about this, one thing that we always can turn back to is, again, those resources that are authored by Native people, and also beginning to build better ties to the contemporary Native communities that are around you. And there in Maine, you have that incredible opportunity to do that. And that enriches these conversations and helps to make those things, like Heather, what you were just saying, like make those translatable in a way that's understandable for us in this place right now. And so I do understand what you're saying. And I think that we kind of have to layer over all of these levels of understanding to get a complete picture, right? So we have to have the archaeological portion to kind of appease the scientific community and have that part of the conversation, which it deserves to be a part of the conversation. So we have to understand migration in that way. We also always have to include language. We have to understand how language, these language families that exist today, were moved across space and time, and how those line up with the way that tribes and nations understand their own origin stories. When you have all of that information together in one place, it gives you a really good and complete understanding of the terms that we're using.
Yeah, and Endawnis is hitting on something just overarching in all of this, is that all of these are English language terms that we're using. They're all derived from a European language, and the idea of generalizing Native peoples under, singular terminology originates in Europe. And it's only really through the lens of our own languages that you really start to get an understanding of how a people would view themselves as indigenous. And from tribe to tribe to tribe, that could change depending upon the lens that they view themselves through. My firstborn's people is the San Felipe Pueblo, and their belief is that they didn't migrate to the territory. They actually rose from underneath the earth into the place that they are now. So there's different understandings depending on the people, and it's usually always built into the language. I always tell people the language is the blueprint of the culture. And in the next presentation, we're going to be talking a lot about language and sense of place through language.
And actually, Chris, that gives us a really good segue from the portion that I am leading to yours. So I will go ahead and turn it over to you. And I'm sure that these two conversations will kind of intersect in other ways.
Mm-hmm. All right. So, ladies and gentlemen, good to see you all. You've heard me a little bit talking. I do get kind of wordy, so that's probably why Endawnis gave me the whole hour for this presentation. But as you know, I am also the new executive director of the Abbey Museum, and the first Passamaquoddy and first Wabanaki person to head the Abbey Museum. And the Abbey Museum, for those that don't know, is located in Bar Harbor, Maine, and focuses on Wabanaki cultures, histories, and arts, as well as telling the story of contemporary Wabanaki communities. And part of my job is I'm not just the executive director, I'm also senior partner to Wabanaki Nations, which is the other half of my job title. And what that refers to is a new addition to the job title that I have. And what it is about decolonizing the way a colonial museum operates. The Abbey Museum has been, and is still, but has always been a Bar Harbor institution. And the board members have always been majority non-native. Very few natives involved on the board historically until very recently. And now the structure of the Abbey Museum is a majority Wabanaki board. As a colonial museum, it's a new model for how to present Native histories, where the shift of power has been shifted from the colonial narratives over to the Wabanaki peoples ourselves to tell our own stories in that space. And today I'm going to be talking, a little bit about language, some of our, Wabanaki language, a little bit about our oral histories, and about some of the place names within the state, our communities, the Native communities that exist today, a few towns and rivers that I'm sure you'll be familiar with, and hopefully this opens up some conversation. Maine is actually full of, one of the few places, in New England that wasn't overly named with English place names. There is a lot. Trust me on that, but if you go down to southern New England, it's much more pervasive, the renaming, and that's a big part of colonization, really. If you're going to take over a territory, one of the things that happened was Columbus, discovered the Caribbean in 1492, and then the papal bull for the Catholic Church issued the Doctrine of Discovery in 1493, which basically gave the permission to any European to land on a territory that they deemed was unoccupied, place a flag on it, and then discover it for their European king. When it comes to what we call New England now, this is, Wabanaki and Wampanoag and other tribal territories. That's literally the English, discovering through their process that they had invented themselves, unoccupied territories that had actually been devastated by disease prior, and were not really unoccupied. They were just shortly unoccupied for less than 2 decades before they were landed on. And commonly, the names of everything was renamed to something after England. So in Connecticut, Hartford, and then other Plymouth even, the site of the Mayflower landing, originally Patuxet, was named after Plymouth, England, which was the origination point of the Mayflower journey. So the renaming of all of our territories is a big part of colonization, and so it's a really a big part of trying to erase, Native peoples, and that's part of what's been happening over the past couple of hundred years is that we've been speaking in the English language, thinking about Maine and Wabanaki territories through the English language, and using English terminology to do that. And there's more to the story. We have a lot of places that are in the state that do have Wabanaki origins with their names, and I'm going to be going into that a little bit. So let's see if I can get my screen share to work properly for you. Let's see, go to the beginning. Come on. There we go. Okay. So Wabanaki place names of Maine and beyond the colonial borders. And I had to draw that on there, beyond the colonial borders, because, the idea of the state of Maine has only been around for 200 years, right? And even where did that name come from? Maine, M-A-I-N-E. That's from the best I've looked into it, there's no real explanation. It's just that when the French were controlling the territory before it became part of the United States, they called it the province of Maine, and it just kind of carried over once the Commonwealth took it over, and then eventually the state of Maine got created. So that's not a Wabanaki place name whatsoever. And the border between the U.S. and Canada actually goes right through my people's homeland in Beskidamukadek. And so what's now known as the St. Croix River, what we know as Scudic, or the Scudic River, is actually the border between U.S. and Canada, but it drives right straight through the territory of my traditional homelands. And Passamaquoddies are recognized as sovereign indigenous people on the United States side, but have only recently gotten recognition on the Canadian side, as if we didn't live on both sides of the river, so that's what colonization and colonial borders do, is once again do a lot of erasure of, the indigenous home territories that we're in. So a short summary of how our world began in oral tradition, and this is very short, okay? The story is much, much longer than this, but I wanted to give you all just a summary, and this is where the idea of Turtle Island comes from, and different tribes have different versions of this story, so do not think that this is the version or, the only way that this story happens. This is just kind of a short summation of how Wabanaki folks believe the world, the land that we live on was created. In the beginning, Mother Earth fell through the hole in the sky and landed in the ocean. The Earth, at one time was all ocean, is what we believed. And the turtle was the first to help her, allowing her to ride on his shell. And the animals worked together, and with their work, they retrieved soil from the bottom of the ocean and placed it on the back of the turtle. So Mother Earth was used to build the home on the back of this turtle shell, and they kept building and kept building. And by spreading the soil across the shell, she forced it to grow to a great size, creating mountains, valleys, plains, etc. in the process. And in this way, Mother Earth built Turtle Island. So what we think of as the force of, Mother Earth is not necessarily the planet that we're talking about when we're talking, once again, we're using English here, we're talking kind of the force of life, everything that gives life. So therefore it's given the name Mother, because women are life givers. Traditionally in our cultures, we think of women as life givers. In Southern Algonquin cultures where they do a lot of agriculture, women do the growing of the food and actually control about 75% of the creation of food sources. And men are considered life takers, whether it's hunting, fishing, or protection of your own people. So therefore, a life-giving source, a force that has a power of giving life, would be a maternal source, a mother. So in this way, Mother Earth built Turtle Island, which is now known as North America. Later on, Mother Earth would give birth to Glooscap, and this is where the Wabanaki peoples, culturally, we all share the stories of our creation as people, Wabanaki peoples, from being named Glooscap, and also his twin brother Malsum, and eventually, who was eventually reincarnated as Glooscap's grandmother, the woodchuck. So even in our traditional stories, Glooscap, our creator, who had supernatural powers and abilities and had the power of creation, we have stories about him being raised by his grandmother. And culturally, in Passamaquoddy, Penobscot, Micmac, Maliseet cultures, we believe, that grandmothers achieve the highest social stature. So if you come to Zibayag or Badakmiguk, Indian Township, or Pleasant Point, the Passamaquoddy reservations, you'll notice the Catholic Church or churches are both named on each reservation St. Anne's. And there's a reason for that. When the French brought Catholicism to us, we were hit by a lot of disease. And one of the things that our leaders noticed was that the French were not dying of these same diseases. And so many Zogams, chiefs, brought their people to the French missionaries and began to live around them. And essentially, when they began their missions, the Passamaquoddies chose St. Anne as the patron saint of the Indian missions in our territory, because Anne is the mother of Mary, therefore the grandmother of Jesus. So in a way, what I like to tell people is that the Catholics didn't come and convert us. We actually took the Catholic religion and converted it to our belief system. So there's a little bit of a religious synchronicity that's going on there. In our sense of place for Wabanaki peoples here, the English language is, of course, a foreign language. Oops, I misspelled therefore, sorry about that. Therefore, can never I'm a horrible speller, I get that from my dad. Can never accurately describe the homelands of Wabanaki peoples. The English language often labels things, and sometimes those labels can be somewhat arbitrary when it comes to naming a place, such as Maine. Oftentimes it has a reference to a person who, quote unquote, discovered or quote unquote founded an area. And examples of that are town names in New England, in Maine, English derived river names, and the state of Maine, the name of the state of Maine itself. Wabanaki place names are relational. The way our language works is so much different. We don't build our sentences with, subject, verb, that type of thing. Our language is very verbal in that, and it's also relational. So a word can change depending on its context, what's used before and what's used after. The meaning of it can change based on the relationship it has to other words around it, or the other things that you were describing in the context. So Wabanaki place names are relational, usually a descriptor of the landscape itself or how a particular part of the landscape relates to what surrounds it. And a great example of that is Katahdin. So if you ever say Mount Katahdin, this is something that Wabanaki people always kind of giggle at, because the word Katahdin in our language translates to great mountain or the greatest mountain. And in relation to the other mountains in the state of Maine, it is, of course, the tallest mountain, the greatest mountain that we have. So it already translates to great mountain or greatest mountain. And if you were to use the English name Mount Katahdin, it's to us like you're saying Mount Great Mountain. So it's more proper to just say Katahdin. And you'll see that a lot of Mainers are actually catching up with that. Even though the maps still call it Mount Katahdin, many Mainers these days have really woken up and just call it Katahdin. And that's what I would encourage you to use going forward. The same is true of Wabanaki Wabanaki names for each other and for other peoples. So examples, Winuch, which is our word for a white person or a French person, because originally in our territory, most of them would have been French, depending on how it's used. The etymology of that word actually originates from a question, when, uch. In other words, who are you? Where do you come from? So our word for Europeans essentially was, was a question, and with an unknown origin. And we kind of only knew of them as coming from across the water, that they must have lived on a land somewhere far away, but we only knew them as coming across water. Skijin is a word for a native person, any native person in our language. And it's relational to that word wenich, because it literally would translate to surface dweller. So in relation to Europeans who are coming on ships from Europe and staying on those ships when they first originally arrived in the 15 and 1400s, and not really coming onto land and making settlements, they would have been the water dwellers, and our reference to all native peoples would have been surface dwellers, the people that lived on the land. So once again, we translate Skijin now as just a native person, any native person, but the literal translation, the etymology of that word is surface dweller, and that shows the relationship, the relational aspect of how our languages work. Endawnis mentioned the nativeland.ca map. This is a screenshot of Wabanaki territories, if you were to look at it through the nativeland.ca map. And as you can see, when it comes to the modern day tribes that we have these days, and some of these tribes are Eastern and Western Abenaki tribes as well, that politically kind of were forced to organize as the Abenaki tribes because of their history. You can see that our homelands really overlap each other. There is no demarcated border of any sort, and so when it comes to people living in those borderland territories, when it comes to people living in those borderland territories, oftentimes there was intermarriage that went along, and how did we figure out who was who? We typically follow the mother's line. So just as Endawnis was mentioning, the same thing happens in Southern New England. They are matrilineal. When I married my wife, who is Mashantucket Pequot, I moved into her territory, raised my children in her homelands, following that old tradition, even though now we're these days, our kids are getting older and we're now coming back to Maine. Wabanaki Confederacy, I just want to point that out really quickly. Sometimes people get a little confused between what is Wabanaki and what is the Wabanaki Confederacy. So Wabanaki, I'm going to break that down for you in a little bit, but it's the name of the peoples, the current 5 tribes that we have in Maine and Canada, and New Hampshire and Vermont, which would be Passamaquoddy, Penobscot, Mi'kmaq, Maliseet, and Abenaki. The Confederacy is really just a point in time. In our history, we weren't always friendly with one another, even though we have similar belief systems, similar languages. Sometimes we did compete for territory, and sometimes we did so violently. And at one point in our history, right around the end of the 17th century, tribal leaders got together and said that this way of war is destroying us. We cannot exist and sustain ourselves any longer. And they made an agreement of peace amongst the tribes and set a set of protocols. So the Confederacy was created as a way to make peace, and also to kind of lay claim to whose territory is whose. So you could cross somebody's territory, and if you're a Wabanaki in the Confederacy, that was not a problem. You just knew whose homeland it was. So that was one of the ways that we decided, was by confederating under that. And in those protocols, we would do things like, if a Passamaquoddy chief would die, then the next chief was chosen by the other Wabanaki leaders. They would all come to the Passamaquoddy community where the chief had died, and their leaders would choose the next Passamaquoddy chief, who was typically a firstborn or secondborn son, or possibly a brother. They were almost always men. Or if there was nobody that was suitable in the family ranks, then they would choose somebody from the community. But our leaders in our own communities were not chosen by ourselves. Under the Confederacy. So the Confederacy is really just a moment in time. Wabanaki is the cultural term for all of the tribes because of our belief in the stories of Glooskap as part of our creation. So in a modern day map, if you have the colonial borders drawn in there, this is where Wabanaki territories are. And you can see we're kind of demarcated with the St. Lawrence River as the northern part of our territory here, going all the way out to Cape Breton, what is now Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, through the state of Maine into New Hampshire and Vermont. All of these tribes, you see Norridgewock, Kawasuk, all of the Pennacook, these tribes on this western part here, these would have been all what would have are known today as Abenaki tribes, much more closely related. However, during the time of the American Revolution, or just before that, the burgeoning Americans were fearful of the Abenaki's relationship with the French, and ended up in, once the border lines of what is now the state of Maine got drawn out, the Abenaki tribes were driven out of the state of Maine and largely driven out of New Hampshire and Vermont. They still remain there. There's still pockets of them, but in the U.S. side, especially for the Abenakis, you know, if you were to raise yourself or raise your children as Abenaki, the U.S. government, the state governments were doing things like, you know, taking them and actually putting them in insane asylums. One of the reasons for that is that if you had somebody declared insane, then you could take their land. You know, so if you were to stay on the U.S. side, that was likely your fate. So many of them did hide, or they did migrate to Canada and created two communities called Odanak and Wolinak. Penobscot, and some of them did join the Penobscots and became part of that community as well. Passamaquoddies were once again the border. The St. Croix River is the middle of our territory right there. That is actually the name of our namesake comes from this territory right at the end of the Scoodic River. Maliseet speak almost exactly the same language as Passamaquoddy people do, but they are the river version of our culture on the Willistic River, or what is now known as the St. John River. So this just, you know, gives you an idea how vast the territory is of Wabanaki or Wabanaki, the land of the dawn. It's an accurate descriptor of our geography because we are the first tribes that see the sunrise every morning. And part of our cosmology is that as Wabanaki peoples, that it's our duty to sing the sunrise up in the morning so that the rest of the country will have sunlight during the day. At the Abbey Museum, you'll come and you'll see this map right here, which is the same territory we were just looking at with native place names, some native place names put on it on some of the rivers, without the colonial borders, so that you can, and what I love about this map is that when you look at it, you can actually, if you spend enough time with this map, you can start to really understand how our ancestors lived here before roads and towns and colonial borders were added. We could travel journeys of 1,000 miles. We could go all the way from Gaspé up here, the Gaspé Peninsula, you know, in the northern St. Lawrence River area, all the way down here to the Long Island Sound area. And historically we did, because we used wampum. And now wampum is our beads that are made from the quahog shell and from the channeled whelk. And the quahog clam only exists just a little bit above Cape Cod here. We do not have the right types of clam shells to make the purple beads up in our territories here. But when the Confederacy was created, the way we preserved our history and our protocols for how the Confederacy was to be run was we preserved them with pictographs on wampum belts. And the beads were all got from the Long Island Sound and the Cape Cod area here from these southern New England tribes. We remembered how to make these journeys with songs. So, you know, we have oral history, but before the French Catholics came along and kind of destroyed the tradition, we used to remember these journeys through songs. Songs are a much easier way to remember things, and we use that in America all the time. In fact, all of us learn the alphabetical order through the ABC song, and none of us would ever forget that song. In fact, I know all the 16 counties of the state of Maine from that old Yankee Doodle tune that was remade to have the 16 counties. stories. With songs, you can remember things in vast details, and journeys of 1,000 miles can be remembered. And waterways were the superhighways of the people. And if you pay attention, you can start to see how portages would happen from one river to another. So a tribe in this territory here might take this river over to this territory and then would portage over to Connecticut, which is the Connecticut River, and make their way down this superhighway to get to wampum tribes to get what they needed. And in fact, just 100 years ago, when Plymouth was celebrating its 300th anniversary, now it's the 400th anniversary of the landing of the Mayflower, they actually invited Penobscot and Passamaquoddy chiefs and people from the villages here. And back at that time, they were still traveling by birch bark canoe. And they took freshwater river routes as well as known coastal water routes to get down there. You know, a heck of a journey here. It would probably be about 8 hours by car. You can imagine by canoe how long that journey was, but they still understood those traditional waterways and those traditional passages even just 100 years ago. So let's talk about the word Wabanaki. I'm going to break this down for you really quickly. So Wabanaki is the English derivation of Wabanaki terminology for our homelands. And I'm going to give you the version that's in my language. Wabanakiag or Chikwabanakiag, it depends on the tribe. It's all a little bit different. But in Passamaquoddy, the word is Chikwabanakiag, and that would be the same as Wabanaki, the people of the dawn. And I'm going to break down the etymology of that word. So the root word of Chikwabanakiag is Chikwi, and what that word translates to, it's a kind of a command. It means, you know, look this way or come this way, depending on context. You know, so if you see somebody way over there and you want them to come see something, you yell at them, Chikwi. You know, you would yell at them to come over this way. And so that's the root word of where that comes from. Chikwaban is where the sun, it actually translates to the sun first looks our way. That's the literal translation, or simply the dawn, when the morning time, when the sun is rising. Chikwabanakiag, when you add that akig at the end of it, that now becomes a place. So now Chikwabanakiag is the place where the sun first looks our way, which is what we would call the land that we live in. And then Chikwabanakiag pluralizes it. So then it becomes people when you pluralize it. So then it translates long ways, the people of the place where the sun first looks our way, or simply the people of the dawn land. So that's a little bit of, so Wabanaki is totally fine for you to use because in the Abenaki dialects, they would actually translate it as Wabanakig. So they wouldn't have that chkwa at the beginning of it. And so we all, when we speak English, commonly use the term Wabanaki, and it has become regular usage. But in our old languages, we do have a slightly different version of it, typically. So the names of Maine's tribes. Passamaquoddy is once again the anglicized version of our own word for ourselves, which is Beskudamugati, the people who spear pollock. And that refers to the mouth of the Scoodic River, the yearly sea run fish, the pollock, would run in great numbers through up the St. Croix River to spawn up Scoodic, and we would gather every spring in Zibayik, which is our traditional tribal headquarters, Pleasant Point, Maine, and on both sides of the river, and set up large villages for fishing purposes, because you could spear enough pollock that you could dry the fish, and you would literally have enough meat to get you through your winter. Just from the abundance of the ocean. We harvested just about everything from the ocean, but we were known for that seasonal migration for the pollock run every year. And so hence our name, Beskudamugati, which in the anglicized version is Passamaquoddy. Penobscot, Panawapskek, refers to where their island is right now. So they have a different name for their island, but it's a word in their language that translates to the place where the rocks open out on the Penobscot River. So that's where Indian Island is. The river widens quite a bit to accommodate the island, and that's where that opening is. That's what they know as Panawapskek. And so the anglicized version of that became Penobscot, which is the name now for the river, the Penobscot River. So their namesake, Panawapskek, the people, their namesake is the river, and their homelands are the river and all of the watershed that would depend upon the river. Maliseet. Now this is, once again, it's relational. So this was an English version of another tribe's word for the Maliseet people, because in our languages, the word Maliseet means they speak slowly. Now, of course, a tribe wouldn't name themselves, we speak slowly. It makes no sense. What happened was explorers in the going through the St. Lawrence River asked tribes in Micmac territories about the people on the Willistic River, the St. John River, and that's how they described them, as they speak slowly. Now, to a Micmac person, that would make sense, because the way they speak to us sounds very fast, and when actually the way their language is constructed is actually supposed to sound like their geography. So the way Mi'kmaq is spoken, it sounds like waves crashing upon a rock, whereas Maliseet is almost the exact same language as Passamaquoddy, but it's spoken with a flow to it that sounds like a river flowing. So for a Mi'kmaq speaker, it would sound like they are speaking slowly. So that's really a bad misnomer for the Maliseet people, who know themselves as Wolastoqiyik, which means the people of the beautiful river. So Wolastoq, that's what we know as the St. John River, that would have been the beautiful river. And that is their, once again, where they make their traditional homelands is along Wolastoq, what's known as the St. John River. Abenaki is a French derivation of Wabanakiek, once again from their dialects, and the French kind of took the term and made it their own, Abenaqua. That's kind of why on the US side, Abenakis will say Abenaki, and in the Quebec side, they say Abenaki. Because in Quebec they still speak French, so they use that French pronunciation of Abenaqua and say Abenaki. On the U.S. side, the Abenaki say Abenaki, but it's all just kind of a derivation of their own word Wabanakiek. And once again, they had different names, Norridgewock, Saco, Kennebec, depending on where they live. But due to the force of colonization, they were forced out of their much of their home territories, or were forced to hide within their own territories. And so politically, they're organized now as the Abenaki tribes. There's 2 communities in Quebec, and there are now communities in Vermont and New Hampshire that are finally getting recognized after hundreds of years of erasure. Mi'kmaq. So it's an all-encompassing term for tribes in the Eastern Maritimes, also called Gaspasian, Iroquois, Acadian, Tarantine. So if you look through historical books, you're going to see all of those names. They all refer to Mi'kmaq. What we know is that Mi'kmaq is not really their own word. It might have derived from another word, Nigama, but what they call themselves is Elnu, which translates simply as the people. And they all speak a similar language. And once again, they really would have known the different Elnu people, the Mi'kmaq peoples would have known each other by the different places that their villages traditionally were throughout the years. Our modern day Wabanaki communities, this is the map that from the film Dawnland, if any of you have seen it. One of the things as senior advisor for that film, I wanted to do was to kind of add some layers for people that were watching the film to start to understand, the state of Maine through a different lens. And so one of the things I advised the filmmakers to do was when they named the modern day Native communities in Maine, not to use the English place names, but rather to use the Wabanaki names for ourselves. And so that's what you see on this map here. And it does have the colonial borders on there. They're kind of understated, but it does give you at least a line of reference to see where we're talking about. So over here on the right, Zibayik, Madakmigook, these are both Passamaquoddy communities. This is Indian Island right here, the Penobscot community. Medexanagiek, this is the Holton Band of Maliseets. Mi'kma'gik, this is Mi'kmaq territory. This would be the Aroostook Band of Mi'kmaqs in modern day times. So the meaning of some of these words, Peter Dana Point is actually the particular name for where Madakmigook comes from. So in the community of Indian Township, we have actually two communities in there, and one of them is called Peter Dana Point. And that is where Madakmigook comes from, and it's our name for that place where it translates to where the land slopes down to meet the water, which is literally, it's just the side of what was once a river, now a lake, and part of our traditional homelands. And then Pleasant Point, known as Zibayik in our language, which translates to along the shoreline. And Zibayik, as you can see, near the easternmost point of the U.S., it is along the waterway, right along the shoreline. And is our traditional headquarters. We would, in the winter time, be inland in Madakmigook and other areas for hunting purposes, but in the spring we would migrate over to the mouth of Squiddig in order to harvest the pollock. And so both of those territories are our traditional homelands, and we just would have used them at different times of the year. And then, of course, the Passamaquoddies on the other side of the river, what is now known as St. Andrews, Gwinnasquamcook, which means the sandy point. So as I said, they're just getting recognition now finally by the Canadian government, but that is the name of that particular community that is finally, after hundreds of years, even though they've always existed there and we've always known about them. And in fact, I have blood relatives from Gwinnasquamcook. But they're just finally getting recognition as Passamaquoddy peoples today. Holton, Medexanagiek, that translates to hard on the shoes. What that refers to is at the river, there's a portage there. The waterway gets a little bit too rough and there's a portage, but it's a very rocky portage with very sharp stones. So that place is known for the portage. And what they're referring to is the portage was very rough on your moccasins. It would tend to tear up your shoes. And so that's how it was named. Indian Island. And so I'll do my best to pronounce with their writing system because their system is a little bit different than ours, but Alnapai Menahan, the People's Island. So that would be the name of the actual island, which is part of their reservation territory in modern day times. And then Odanak, which is the one of the Abenaki communities in Quebec, that comes from our own language, in Passamaquoddy at least, and also they have a version of this in Abenaki as well. Udenig is the word we use for a town or a village. So in modern day times, if we were going to say we're going to town, we would say Udenig, which means, it would be the closest town. So for us in Indian Township, it would be the town of Princeton if we were saying that relationally. If we were in Zibayik, it would likely be Eastport. So Udenig can be something else depending, but Odanak is the Abenaki version of that, and that literally refers to the village that was created around the Catholic Indian mission for Abenakis. Place names in the area with Wabanaki roots. Madawaska. Madawaskiuk, where the water flows over the grass. It's also, it originally comes from Edmonton, Alberta, but we also have a town in the state of Maine called Madawaska, and it's once again a descriptor of an area around close by. Connecticut, once again in Passamaquoddy, it's Connecticut with a Q, means something long and straight. In Abenaki, it's Quineticut, Quinetitek. There we go. Okay, I get tongue-tied when I try to change it here. Quinetitek, which means very long river. And in Southern Algonquin dialects, Pequot and Wampanoag, it's Quinnetucket, which translates to the long tidal river. So you notice that in all three of those terms, we're naming the river, what's now known as the Connecticut River. And all three, depending on the tribe, have slightly different terminologies for it. But if you ever looked at a map of the Connecticut River, you'll notice that it's a very long, straight north-south flow. And it's to describe it as something long and straight or very long is an accurate description for the northern tribes. And for the southern tribes in the area where the river empties out, the Connecticut River is has a tidal range that goes all the way up to the city of Hartford. The tides will raise, all the way up, even as far as Hartford, Connecticut. And in the 1930s, there was a hurricane that hit the territory, and the storm surge was so large, and it drove all the way up the Connecticut River that it flooded the city of Hartford. So to those tribes, once again, relationally, it's once again a long river, but it's known for its tidal aspects. Quebec City is known in our languages as Quebec. So, the province as well, Quebec, comes from this as well. So where Quebec City is located is literally where the river ends. And so that's where that name derives from. Massachusetts comes from Southern Algonquin dialects, Massachusetts, Wampanoag term for place of the foothills. And if you think about the area around Plymouth or even around Boston, before Boston was Boston, it was called Shawmut. It was a peninsula, and it was an area, it was a bay that was surrounded by a lot of foothills on their way into the inner hills in the state. And by putting that on the end, that makes it a place. So they're naming a place there. So that's where the name of Massachusetts comes from, is the relational name for the coastal area of eastern Massachusetts by the Wampanoag people. The Kennebec River in Penobscot means the river of the large body of water. And once again, Penobscot Abenakis in their own language, they would translate that. It's the river that's emptying out from a very large lake, Madamascontis Lake, Madamascotis in Penobscot, Little Alewife Place. So the alewives are, of course, river herring. We depended upon the river herring every year. We've dammed up the rivers and we've kept them out of our lakes, but we're in the process these days of undamming, getting rid of all the old logging dams so that the river herring can once again make their way back up into their waters and freshwater. And it's actually better for our lakes when that happens, by removing these elements of colonization that have blocked fish passage. When the alewives get up into freshwater lakes, what they do is they eat the algae. And if Mainers know that we have an algae problem in several of our lakes, and one of the reasons why is the alewives do not get there. They don't eat the algae. When they eat the algae, then the oxygen levels go up, and all of life in the water, it becomes cleaner, and there's more fish to actually be had. And by having the river herring run up the rivers to our lakes every year, we actually give food for the eagles and other preying animals. So therefore, human beings aren't necessarily competing. We would use river herring to eat, alewives to eat, but we also use them as fertilizer for planting, and using a lot of other fish as well. So as the yearly calendar moves along, we would work with that, and in the spring we expect the alewives every year. So just some resources, once again, to go over as I finish up and go into questions here. Once endawnis mentioned nativeland.ca, it's a crowdsourced map project. So as, Indigenous people are a lot of people that are crowdsourcing it. So it does change a little bit, and it's not exactly perfectly accurate. Of course, there's no way you can actually get that down. But what it does show is Indigenous territories without colonial borders. You can also view the landscape by language grouping. So Algonquin, you've heard me mention that before. Passamaquoddies, Penobscots, Wampanoags, all speak different dialects of Algonquin, and Algonquin is the largest language family in existence of native languages, and goes from North Carolina up through the Maritimes, and then the Ojibways and other tribes migrated west and now reaches, you have Algonquin dialect spoken by Blackfeet as well, all the way in Alberta, Canada. So you can view the landscape by language grouping, and you can also view it by treaty, which is an interesting way to view it. And if you ever do choose the treaty button on the nativeland.ca, what you'll see is that there are, on the East Coast, there are no treaty lands marked out, and that's because those treaties were not made with a U.S. government. It did not exist. The treaties that were being made with East Coast tribes were made with kings and queens of European countries, and therefore are not marked out on as treaties with the United States. The Abbey Museum, of course, is a great resource. We are currently closed right now, but we will be hopefully opening this year. Due to the pandemic, we are struggling a little bit, but we do have a lot of information, as well as an educator hub where you can find resources on Wabanaki place names on the abbeymuseum.org website. The Acadian National Park Service worked with the Abbey Museum and the Wabanaki communities to create something called a document called Chief Astaku's Domain, which really describes the area in the MDI Ellsworth territory of the state of Maine, and once again includes a lot of historical information, use of land, as well as native place names. There's a resource book that was created through the American Friends Service Committee close to 30 years ago now, called Wabanaki of Maine and the Maritimes. That was probably the original teacher's guide for how to teach about Wabanaki tribes and cultures before LD 291 and the creation of resources like we have at the Abbey Museum. There are some tribal sources that you can go to. One of the newer ones is PassamaquoddyPeople.com, which is a Passamaquoddy sourced culture history portal. Very interesting stuff. So once again, we talk about the land, we talk about our language, and you'll also hear the recordings, the Jesse Walter Fuchs recordings, which are the first recordings of native music ever in history on Edison's wax cylinders. The Penobscot Nation Museum you can also visit for a lot of good information as well. So tribal museums I always point to as really great sources. The Abbey Museum, even though we talk about all of them as a colonial museum, I tend to want to center the voices of the tribes first, and that's one of the things we try to do within the Abbey Museum itself. So I always point to the tribal sources first, but do not hesitate to come to the Abbey Museum, because over the last 5 years we have done a lot of updating to tribally source the material rather than have interpretation. So that's where I'm going to end my presentation right there. And I'm going to now open it up for questions.
Chris, can I just say that I really enjoyed your presentation and I learned a lot. I think that working with someone who is from the other side of the country and who has given me so much insight into this place where I am a guest. I'm a guest in this space and in New England, and unless I'm in my own homeland, I behave as a guest in these other places. So I just want to say thank you that I learned some new Wabanaki things, and my Wabanaki pronunciation has grown by leaps and bounds being around you and Roger. So I just want to say thanks.
I guess I have a question about sources. And so I actually don't come from this part of the country either. I grew up in the Southwest. And so what I remember though, learning there, we had a lot of primary sources that were multilingual. So we had sources that were obviously written in sort of an English alphabet, but they had we had like Hopi and Zuni language on one side, and then we would have the translation. And I found that as a young learner very, very important. And I think, as both of you have been speaking about centering Native people's own language and own sort of the specificity of terms, I think that would be really important. And I was wondering, since I'm unfamiliar with the source base, are there those sources available, those translations?
So yes, so the Passamaquoddy Maliseet language is actually totally online, and we have a 20,000 plus entry dictionary that we've also created, a project that my father, David Francis, and others worked on for 40 plus years that is all culminated. And so online, the entire dictionary, as long with videos and everything else, a whole pronunciation guide, all the information you would find in the dictionary and more is called pmportal.org. I probably should have put that in my resources. I'm sorry about that. But yeah, pmportal.org, and that'll get you to the Passamaquoddy Maliseet dictionary. Oh, perfect. Thank you for providing that link. And one of the things that my father's done, he's written over 40 books, but none of them are in English. You know, Passamaquoddies in Penobscots, a lot of our tribes have been kind of way ahead of the game when it comes to the way we have approached how to teach our children within the classroom context, which is not traditionally how we would have done it. You know, so people like my father and others have worked with the University of New Brunswick, and you can find a lot of resources on through them as well with Robert Levitt on Passamaquoddy Maliseet language and history. So one of the things that we do is we oftentimes, when we produce these resources, we will translate them, some of them, and to have the English version and then the Passamaquoddy version right next to it on the other page. And that's important, you know, because number one, it lets the students know that number one, there's people that speak this language and can read this, you know, there's kids that can read this, you know, so it puts us in the now instead of in the past, right? And it starts to give that level of, you know, you know, a little small level of translation. You know, the words that I pointed out in the presentation, if you were to start reading those, you would start to see those start to pop out. And maybe they look a little bit different with different prefixes or suffixes, but you start to recognize the root words. And that's the beginning of starting to understand our language, is really starting to understand those root words. So while you won't learn the language that way, it does at least start to open up that window to the blueprint of our culture, which is our language, and that lens of how we see things. And also that you cannot translate things properly from English to Passamaquoddy. It just doesn't work. So as I mentioned, we translate words to make it easier for English speakers. So we translate the word Skijian as just meaning another native person, any native person. But to ourselves, we understand it as surface dweller. So within the language, it does have a different meaning than how we translate it. If we were to say surface dweller to now, in this context of 2020, that's all of us, right? You know, so therefore it wouldn't quite fit. So you know, we translate it nowadays as just another native person, so people kind of get the understanding of what the origination of that term was made for. So yeah, you know, we do have a lot of resources that are put out there that do have the English as well as the native language source, and that's one of the things my father always kind of emphasized. Even when he would do presentations, educational presentations, he would sing the music, and he would also tell stories first in our language so that you could see the mannerisms, you could see what's funny and what's not. Even though you don't understand it, you could see it for yourself. And then you hear the English version afterwards, and then you can kind of draw the dots and connect the dots together to how it's all presented. And it gives an impactful experience for any non-native speaking student.
And another really quick thing to add on to that is as you go through your lesson plans and as you go through your curriculum for the year, again, what I like the term that you used, Lauren, and we also want to center those Indigenous languages as the primary and most accurate terms that we can use. So when you come across something like poem at Akomawt, you can put that as the original term because that was the most accurate term that we have in Wampanoag, and then in parentheses you can provide that translation, otherwise known to the English as King Philip, or you can still provide some kind of context for your learners and for your students, but just providing that primary, first name in the actual language that is the most accurate is a really great way to, again, kind of readjust those frames for your students so that they can take that lens into other spaces.
Yeah, Cynthia.
I have a question about the origin stories. We read Giants of the Dawnland, and we read several Glooscap legends. How do we talk with students about those as origin stories, and to what extent are they believed today compared to our scientific understanding of those same events?
So, once again, there's different versions, depending upon the tribe, the pronunciations change, and even some of the characters will change within the story. So we don't tell them all the same. In Passamaquoddy, we say Glooscap. Penobscots, Abenakis say Glooskabi. So there's slightly different pronunciations. And Malsum, his twin brother, sometimes he has the head of a wolf, sometimes he doesn't. It depends on who's telling the story there as well. So, and that's Malsum is actually the word that we use for wolf in Passamaquoddy as well. So, it derives from Malsum himself, who was a very cunning, clever, and not to be trusted individual in our stories, so but yeah, to what extent are they still believed? I mean, we have had the Catholic religion with us since the 1700s, slowly, but as I mentioned before, we kind of took the Catholic religion and kind of made it our own. So while we go to church and hear the stories of Genesis and other things of that sort, outside of the church, our belief in our traditional stories is very strong, and our spirituality is very strong. And the story of how we were created was Glooscap, in the Passamaquoddy version anyway, Glooscap fired arrows into the ash trees, which is, of course, the ash tree is what we make our baskets out of. And from the splinters, the tree split apart, and out walked the first man and woman. And he would call us Jagwabanaki. He would call those people Jagwabanaki or Wabanaki. And that's where our name was given. Was from Glooscap, and that's the people of the dawn. That's how that arrived, and I believe in that wholeheartedly in that story, because I look at the health of our people and I compare it to some of the times of the health of what's going on in what we would refer to in English as the natural world, right? Which is really just the world, but now man has, or human beings have, built and destroyed a lot of it. So now we have to demarcate the two different places. Sorry, I lost my train of thought there. What was I talking about? The natural world.
Well, I had asked you about, like, to what extent are they believed? Because I find with teaching students, right, even the Christian origin stories and Christian creation stories, many of these children aren't raised in any kind of, church there. And so they always ask me, do people really believe that today?
Yeah.
And
I totally caught up with what I was going to say now. So when it comes to the ash tree, right? We have an invasive beetle that is in the territory and has just finally this year showed up in the state of Maine, and that is the emerald ash borer. And for us as Wabanaki people, we see that as literally an attack on our very existence. If the ash trees are gone, the source of our creation, will we survive? we have a very strong fear that if we allow the emerald ash borer to take out all of our ash trees, that there's a fear that that would be the end of the Wabanaki people. And we actually have a story that goes along. If Glooskap left us behind, he taught us how to live, and he left us behind and gave us some orders to always remain in the land of the dawn. And he warned us that if he were to ever return, then that is a sign of the end of the world. And so we kind of see the emerald ash borer as one of those beginning signs of the return of Glooskap coming to fight this very large war that he's, and would signify the end of the world. So yes, we do, there's a lot of us that have deep spiritual values, especially those of us that try to tie ourselves to the language as much as possible, that do have a very big fear, about what's happening based on our belief in our origin story. So the health of the ash tree is, in a lot of ways coincides with the health of our people. And if we see those start to disappear and get less healthy, a lot of us really worry about the health of our own people. We've been working our way and rebuilding since the 70s, getting out of this mode of being wards of the state and working towards self-determination. But if we lose the part of the land that is literally where we came from, what do we do going forward? And that's really the question that is uncharted territory for us. And is it really a sign that things are about to change in a very, very swift and drastic way? Is the end of the world actually coming? And these are questions we ask amongst ourselves. Yes, we absolutely do believe in these.
And Cynthia, also, I think it's a great opportunity to, use this specific example to talk about how humans understand the world around them, and to tie in, how we can have devoutly Christian political leaders who are also scientists who also abide by rules that were set aside in an origin story. And believe that those are guiding principles for their morals and ethics and the way they conduct themselves. So I think that there are some ties that we can make across for how Native people are living in modernity as people who are also scientists, also part of the scientific community, also part of all of these spaces, but also are tied to our beginning and origin stories in meaningful ways that we enact every day.
There's a wonderful online resource of a conference that was held at UMO about the ash borer and the impact on Wabanaki cultures. It's kind of long. I teach middle school, but we watched a lot of it, and it was a really great connection between.
Yeah, we have a temporary exhibit in the Abbey currently up right now. And wish I could open the building for you all to come see it, but it talks about the very same topic. And it's a little bit easier to digest than that presentation.
Yeah.
Chris, there's a question in the chat about origin stories and where one might find them.
Okay, so once again, you're going to have different versions of them depending on where you go. But one of the oldest written accounts was made by Charles Leland, L-E-L-A-N-D. So if you want to find English language translation accounts, the very first written account was made by Charles Leland, and he recorded not just Passamaquoddy, it was Passamaquoddy, Penobscot, Abenaki, pretty much all Algonquin legends that he could collect. And I believe that's what the book is called, is Algonquin Legends, so they come from Southern New England tribes as well. He does some interesting stuff in that book. He does a lot of interpretation, but he does draw some dots, which actually matches with our oral history, because we actually tell an oral history about our people migrating at the end of the Ice Age, migrating east into Greenland. Charles Leland actually makes some connections with oral histories in Greenland and Iceland with Algonquin oral stories. The truth of all of that, I couldn't really, remark on intelligently because it's really a very, very deep topic. But it's an interesting comparison that Charles Leland found these, connected these dots, and we have an oral history that says that some of our people went, into those territories as well. So what, as I say, a lot of times, science, it takes a little while for it to catch up. If we could dig underneath the ocean and find the archaeological evidence, we could probably, finally, make the scientific proof. But there is definitely some oral history that goes along that puts us in different places. And yeah, Leland's book is probably the oldest written account that I typically send people to, because it has multiple tribes within it, and he does do a good job of describing the differences.
Chris, I want to squeeze in Ruth's question. Go ahead,
Yes.
Ruth.
I'm really interested in where I could find a copy of the story about the ash tree and the emerald ash borer, because I do a lot of science with GMRI with the emerald ash borer. So that's definitely something I could tie in and integrate with if I could find a copy of that legend.
So Cynthia, it's not a legend. It's actually, there was a conference that was held on the effect of it. And Cynthia, it's on the UMO YouTube channel, right?
Yeah, I will find my lesson plan, and it has the link in it, and I can share it back to you.
Great.
I can look for it now, but I'm not sure I can get into my files while I'm watching the Zoom, while I'm on Zoom. Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, it looks like we're on break time right now. So I think we all get a bio break for a few minutes before we pick things back up. Who am I turning it over to, Adonis, after this?
I'll take it, Chris. And then Maine Historical will be coming on at 11:15. So we have about 10 minutes. We're gonna pause the recording and keep the Zoom room open. So we will start back up again in about 10 minutes. Thanks to Chris. Thank you to Endawnis for kicking us off this morning so beautifully. And we will be back soon. Good morning again, everybody. I am happy to welcome our colleagues from the Maine Historical Society as our co-hosts of this morning's webinar. And this next session is going to be with Kathleen Newman and Brittany Cook on the Maine Memory Network and resources for the bicentennial. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Kathleen. We have begun recording the session again, just to let everybody know, so this can be available for those who couldn't be with us this afternoon. And I also just want to second our thanks to both Chris and Endawnis for their work with us this morning and all of the wonderful resources that they shared. We're incredibly grateful. And I would also say that there have been a lot of questions in the chat about the sharing of resources, and we will definitely be sharing those with you. We will also send out an email to participants who are here with us live for those who need a certificate of attendance for their own professional development work. That's no problem at all, and we're happy to provide that for you. So look for a follow-up email, and then certainly we will also share the workshop videos with you as they are ready. They take a little bit to process, so don't look for those tomorrow. We will hopefully have those for you next week, and we would welcome certainly you sharing those with your colleagues. So without further ado, thank you so much to MHS, and Kathleen and Brittany, take it away.
Thank you, Libby. Thanks so much for having us and everybody for being here. So once again, I'm Kathleen Newman, Manager of Education and Public Programs at Maine Historical Society. I'm gonna speak first for MHS's portion of the program today, and then I'll turn it over to Brittany. I'm gonna talk a bit just generally about the Maine Memory Network and some of Maine Historical Society's online tools. And then Brittany is going to talk more specifically about what she has created in terms of bicentennial tools. And I think I'd be happy to take any questions you have when I'm finished speaking, and Brittany will be happy to take questions at the end of her piece too. So I'm going to share my screen and bring up my slideshow. Hope everybody can see this okay. Excellent. Okay. So I'm not sure, I imagine I'm seeing some familiar faces in the crowd today and some new faces. So some of you are probably very familiar with Maine Historical Society and what we can offer for teachers and students. And for some of you, this may be very, very new territory. So let me just tell you a little bit about the organization in a nutshell. MHS has been around since 1822, so just 2 years after the state of Maine became the state of Maine. A group of people came together and said that we need an organization that really collects, preserves, studies, and discusses the region's unique history. So just as Maine is marking its 200 years of statehood this year, MHS is coming up on its bicentennial as an organization. And we have on our campus, we're based in downtown Portland. We're right next to the Time and Temperature building, although our friends and our reach extend across the state. But on our campus in Portland, we have a research library. We also have a museum building. The museum building has exhibit gallery space, public programming space. It's also where our museum store is. That's where we greet the public and provide a lot of general information. And also in the care of Maine Historical Society is the Wadsworth Longfellow House and Longfellow Garden. That house was the childhood home of the poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. And is today a wonderful historic house museum, and folks can also visit the garden behind the house. And we exist too online in the form of our database, Maine Memory Network. And Maine Memory Network is going to be the focus of what I'm going to talk about this morning. Now, for those of you that are doing primary source work with your students, you may be interested too, not just in what you can see online, but what you can see in person at the Brown Research Library, which is where sort of like the heart of Maine Historical Society, if you will. Folks come from all over the world to do research in the library, with a lot of print materials, manuscripts, photographs, maps, newspapers, and access to a lot of online databases like genealogical databases that you can use in our library. If you want to do research at the library, students that are visiting the library can access the library for free. We don't charge students if they say they're working on a research project. They want to come and actually see the primary sources. We're not going to charge them anything. I will say typically we only allow photography if a class is visiting. Otherwise, that's a privilege that's usually reserved for someone who has membership. So a student, if they want to photograph something that they're looking at in the library, they would need to be there with a member or be themselves member. But they can access the library for research for free. Visiting MHS and visiting our library right now is a little more complicated than it usually is. So we still want to be as accessible as possible, but we also want to make sure that we're doing things safely, that we're keeping our staff, our collections, and our visitors safe. So right now the library is by appointment only in a pretty small window, Wednesday through Saturday, 1 to 4 p.m. Are also the library's typically closed a lot of holidays and holiday weekends. In general, right now it's required. If you want to visit the library, you need to make an appointment ahead of time. In normal circumstances, we would take walk-ins, but even with accepting walk-ins, we always recommend calling ahead so a librarian can talk to the researcher. What are you looking for? Is there stuff that they can pull and have for you ready before you get there? That's always helpful. So right now, the library has become more and more popular with teachers and students, teachers that really want to get those primary sources in front of their students. Again, a little more complicated to do a library visit right now, but probably not impossible if we were talking about a small group, like maybe 1, 2, or 3 students. The best way to arrange that, or to ask, what can we do, would be to reach out to me directly. That's my email there. And then I'm happy to talk to our staff in the library, see what's available and what we can arrange. So we always love to get primary sources, the real thing, in front of students whenever we can. We encourage library visits. We do what we can to accommodate what a school is looking for. So again, obviously right now that's complicated, but not necessarily impossible. So if you've ever got questions about that, please don't hesitate to reach out and email me. But one of the other really popular ways and really easy ways for anyone, students, teachers, but anyone, to access primary sources through Maine Historical Society and our friends is through Maine Memory Network. So Maine Memory Network is an online database where we've got more than 270 different collecting organizations, and also now some individuals who are contributing digitized collections to this online space that anybody, with all you need is an internet connection, you can access and look at these collections. It doesn't cost anything for a user to use Maine Memory Network or to look at what's up there. So a lot of it is, there are pieces from Maine Historical Society, but it's also pieces from our partners in Maine Memory Network. So from the Bangor Historical Society, for example, or Presque Isle Historical Society. There's more than, there's thousands of pieces of historical records, more than 45,000 different items. As I was saying, you can access Maine Memory Network for free. You can set up an account on Maine Memory Network for free. When you have an account, you can save things that you find. You can put them into little albums. So if you're looking for something in particular and you want to come back to it again really easily, you can put an album together, and then you can share albums with your classmates, with your teacher. It's very easy to do, and it helps you kind of hold on to the stuff that you're looking for. You can search for items with in a variety of ways. You can do a keyword search. You can browse, like if you say, oh, I'm interested in maritime history, you can browse under that topic. Like I was saying, once you have an album, you can save and share historical pieces. So I wanted to actually show you guys the website. Can you guys see this? You guys see the website? Can somebody give me like a thumbs up or something? Okay. So this is Maine Memory Network. That's the web address right there, mainememory.net. This is where everything lives. Just to kind of give you a little taste of some of what's on here, I'm going to log into my account real quick and show you some of the things that I've come across, that I've found can really get students, get them digging into, what's it like to use a primary source. This stuff can help get them excited about learning about history. This is one of my favorite things on Maine Memory Network. We have a ton of photographs.
Sorry, just to interrupt. We can only see your slides, not the.
You can only see my slides. Oh my gosh, I'm sorry. Let me.
That's okay. You just need to unshare and reshare.
Let me fix it. You can see, okay, thank you. Thank you, so sorry about that. So here's one of my favorite photos on Maine Memory Network. This is a double exposure. This is a great kind of bouncing off point for doing some work on photography with students. Often asks you, have they ever taken a selfie before? Have they ever taken a self-portrait? Have they ever worked with Photoshop before to manipulate what an image looks like? Because this is sort of an early example of Photoshop. This is a double exposure of Lauren Olney that was taken around 1910. It's Lauren Olney playing cards with himself. So he set up the camera at one end of the room, or had a photographer set up the camera, snapped a picture, he struck a pose, snap a picture, and then double exposes the image, goes and changes his outfit, doesn't move the camera, sits on the other side of the table, strikes a different pose, and then when they develop the image, this is what they get. So it's an interesting way to talk to students about how things like manipulating images and photoshopping, that's been around almost as long as photography has been around. But before we had computers, how did we do that? So this is kind of a fun image. There's lots of other great stuff on. Here's another one. This is a good one for talking about selfies, self-portrait from about 1895. The photographer, I love this too, because I'm like, how many of you have ever held up the phone and done the selfie like in front of the mirror? Like, we may not want to admit it, but we've all done it. And that's basically what this photographer has done here. You can zoom in on these images, which can be helpful. You can get in real close and see the photographer there. Looks like maybe he's timing the exposure, or I don't know, he's just striking a casual pose. You can lock in on what are some of the things in what looks like his living room. So those are fun. Lots of great documents on Maine Memory Network. This is one from 1692, a deposition. This guy, Thomas Burnham, had an issue with his neighbor. I'll just summarize. He said, someone was milking my cows without my permission. So I decided to scope it out, and I saw, I think it was Rachel Clinton, excuse me. I saw her milking one of my cows, and then she turned into a gray cat and she jumped on my roof. It happens, sometimes it's just like stuff between neighbors. It can get weird. Kids always love this document. That's like fascinating to them. Again, you can zoom right in. This can be an interesting way to look at 300-year-old handwriting and 300-year-old spelling. That can also understandably be a challenge for a lot of students. So everything on Maine Memory Network that's a written document, when you're looking at the description of it, you'll also see, you can look at a full transcription, and that will bring them side by side. And that makes it just that much more accessible to students who might be struggling, with the handwriting, with the cursive. We keep all of the original spelling and grammar, so that can spark some interesting conversations too. But I think that's a fun document. Lots of famous people on Maine Memory Network. I love this photo of Margaret Chase Smith. It's her school photo. So this is something a lot of students can relate to. They have photographs taken of when they're at school. This was the one that Margaret sat for when she was 6, and I just love, I don't know, I feel like I see a lot of like determination on her face, and a lot of, just poise and confidence even at 6 years old. And I personally think that's very telling. Taking pictures of cats is nothing new too. People love to take photos of their cats. Here's a great one from South Portland in 1913. You can see historical objects, so it's not just photographs and written documents. This is another object that always sparks a lot of conversation. It's a lock of George Washington's hair. And this a lot of times will freak kids out or gross them out a little bit, but again, it always sparks a lot of great conversation. I know like culture around hair and saving hair is something that I think Libby could do a talk on all by itself. But this is a great story. So the man that the Longfellow House was built for, the Wadsworth Longfellow House, was Peleg Wadsworth. He was Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's grandfather. He fought during the American Revolution. He was a general. He actually knew George Washington. Fast forward many years, George Washington dies. The whole country kind of goes into mourning, which is a very unique moment in American history, an interesting moment. And one of Peleg's daughters, her name was Elizabeth Wadsworth, asked her father, she wanted something special to remember Washington by, either a sample of his handwriting or maybe a lock of his hair. if he had any hair. So Peleg made that request to Washington's widow, and Martha Washington obliged, and through her late husband's secretary, she sent this lock of her husband's hair to Portland, Maine. Elizabeth will treasure it as her most prized possession. For her, the rest of her very short life, she died when she was really quite young, just like 22 or 23 years old. Passes this on to her sister Zilpah, who will eventually pass it on to her son Henry. Henry was the person who has this lovely locket made to hold the hair, and then it makes its way through his family, through his children, and back to Maine Historical Society. So this very interesting object, again, sparks a lot of great conversation with children. Of course, we've got a lot of Henry related stuff on Maine Memory Network. I love this photograph of Henry and his second wife, Fanny Frances Appleton, their two oldest children, Charlie and Ernie. And again, it's a great launch point to talk about photography when it was still kind of brand new, when you had to sit still for a minute or two to get the picture taken. That might have been hard for little Charlie because his mother has a really good grip on his neck in this photograph right there. So I don't know, you can sort of see again kind of the impatience in the eyes of the little ones there. So that's another great photograph. So I'm going to switch back to my presentation screen here. That's kind of so just like a really quick look at some of the, the treasures of primary sources that you can find on Maine Memory Network. In addition to the historical records themselves, there's a lot of great tool for teachers. We've got guides to using how to use Maine Memory Network and primary sources. So on the education section of the website, you can find all kinds of great tools. A lesson plan library that is growing more and more every day. That's something that Brittany is going to speak to. And we can provide training for you and your students on how to use this in the classroom. And this is something that we do at no cost to you or to the school. And it's also something that we could do virtually right now. So typically I would come to the classroom to show kids how to use this, but there's absolutely no reason we couldn't do it with like a Zoom session like this. So we'd show kids how to access Maine Memory Network, how to search and browse, open up their own account, start to create albums. We also do a program called Taking a Closer Look, where students learn how to approach and work, especially with images. We could really do it with any primary sources, but mostly with how to use images as a primary source, and not just think of it as an image that illustrates a moment in time, but as a tool that can really tell us a lot about that moment in time. So I'm coming to the end of my half of our presentation. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to entertain them. And if not, then I'm going to turn it over to Brittany. I'm also going to put my email in the chat because it looks like some of you are saying, please sign me up for virtual training, which is great. So I'm going to give you my email address, and just the best way to do that is to just shoot me an email, and I will set you up. But in the meantime, if there are other questions, please let me know. It looks like we're good with questions for the moment. Obviously, if they come up later, you guys, you know where to find me. So I'm going to turn it over to Brittany, who's going to kind of take us back into Maine Memory Network and dig a little deeper into our bicentennial education initiative.
Great. All right, thank you so much, Kathleen. So again, I'm Brittany. I've been working with Maine Historical Society for the past year as the Bicentennial Education Fellow. So a lot of my work has been creating classroom resources relating to teaching various aspects of Maine history, with kind of a focus on the fact that we are commemorating our 200th year of statehood, but also just looking at myriad points in Maine history, people, economy, environment. So I am going to share my screen and just give you a little introduction into the Bicentennial Education Initiative. that we have launched. This is kind of our hub for resources for teachers and students relating to teaching Maine history with a kind of a focused lens on the bicentennial. So as we're commemorating statehood, a lot of the resources that I have been creating and also that we've been sourcing are lesson plans. So we've been, as Kathleen had mentioned, we have a robust and growing lesson plan library on Maine Memory Network. You can find all of this at this URL, mainmemory.net/bicentennial. Lots of great resources there. And in addition to the lesson plans that I'm creating, I do also just want to throw out that we have been receiving lesson plans submitted by teachers from all over Maine. So if you have a particular lesson plan or activity that you enjoy teaching to your classroom, that you would like to submit to our lesson plan library, we are actually entering teachers into drawings for winning $400 for your classroom each month throughout the rest of the year. So if that's something that is of interest to you, we can definitely get into a little more about that later. But I do just want to show you some of the lesson plans that we have available. So this is just a way to utilize Maine Memory Network in your classroom, really get kids looking at these primary sources that Kathleen was talking about. So the lesson plans that I've been creating all really do have these primary sources in mind. So some of these that we're looking at right now, a really close look at primary sources, looking at things like daily life in 1820, healthcare history in Maine. This is something that might be of interest to students as they're wondering, you know, how have Mainers dealt with things like the 1918 influenza pandemic? How is that relevant to where we are in healthcare in Maine now? And then we are also actually in the process of updating some of our Wabanaki Studies lesson plans as well, with some wonderful feedback from Wabanaki community partners from throughout the state, which we're very, very grateful for. So I'll just pop into one of these lesson plans. Each of these will have its own kind of overview. You can see if it fits to your grade level. All of these lesson plans are designed to align with Maine state standards. They will all align to social studies state standards. Some of them even align to English language arts, science. I even have one on here that is a sports history lesson plan that has some phys ed standards in there as well. So this one in particular, just looking at, you know, what was daily life in Maine like when it was becoming a state. So the resources are all right here for you. You can take a look at the description of the lesson plan, intended outcomes, what students can expect to learn, what they will be taking a look at throughout the course of the lesson plan. And each of these lesson plans, especially these that are primary source focused, all have a curated slideshow that is complete with, some of them are dozens of Maine Memory Network items, and within the body of the lesson plan you will see guiding questions for students. Taking a close look at these, as Kathleen had mentioned, you can zoom right in on these, but this is just kind of what one of those slideshows looks like, and these are things that you can create yourself if you have an account, that your students can create if they are looking at one of these documents or images and they find something related that could help them with their research. Those accounts are a great way to sort of curate their own really helpful toolbox of primary sources. You can look at it as a regular slideshow, you know, next slide, previous slide. You can also take a look at the list of the entire slideshow and just sort of see the different types of sources that you'll be looking at. This particular one, talking about statehood, will look at, you know, the political landscape as well as the personal. So this will have information about figures like William King, the first governor, and, you know, samplers and art that students were creating. What did folk art look like at this time? You know, looking at the home, looking at fashion, looking at cartography. And then again, within the body of the lesson plan, don't let the length of these lesson plans fool you. They're all aligned in such a way that it'll give you the background information that you need on these topics, and then the guiding questions for students to kind of lead themselves into discussion and looking at primary sources in a close way. So, you know, how do you think that the politics of the day might affect daily life in the late 1810s to early 1820s? Students really starting to think about living during this time. Other lesson plans, we have, again, just myriad topics. In addition to the kind of rotating cast of lesson plans that you'll see on this page, you can take a look at all of our lesson plans that have been created over the years. So again, can take a look at things like Longfellow studies if you're really interested in bringing that into your classroom. Let me find another of my primary source ones. Maine Women's Causes and Influence Before 1920. I know we're on the centennial of the 19th Amendment, but there were so many political movements led by women prior to that, and we have these wonderful primary sources relating to that. And you can also search our lesson plans. So you can search by your grade level. You can go, you see, directly into search all lesson plans. So if there's something really in particular that you're looking for, I know, you know, for example, maritime history, we have a couple of lesson plans relating to maritime history. And again, we do also have lesson plans that have been submitted by teachers throughout the state. This one was an arts and science lesson plan contributed.
She's gone.
I'm just going to go back into the Bicentennial Initiative really quickly because lesson plans are not the only thing that we have been working on throughout this. Also, especially in response to the hybrid teaching that's going to be going on, distance learning and independent student learning. We've also created this virtual learning hub of just multiple different resources. We have video lessons that Kathleen and I have both created, which are, you know, learn a bit of Maine history in 10 minutes or less. They address primary sources that we have on Maine Memory Network, give students kind of a guiding question at the end to think about. There are a couple of things that Kathleen has created on, you know, making butter and ice cream that students can try out using historic methods. So we have several different things on here. Again, if students have questions about past pandemics, we have this great letter resource on here about a student at Bowdoin College who came down with influenza and measles in 1815 and writes about his experiences, which is a great teaching tool. And again, that video, I think it's only about 5.5 minutes long. It's just a really quick way to get students thinking about primary sources. And we also have a great index of online exhibits from the past, including our current exhibit, State of Mind Becoming Maine. So you can visit online exhibits, and there are student response sheets to several of those exhibits as well. So all of these are available for you to download in a Google Drive that you can access right from this virtual learning hub. And that's all right there on that Bicentennial Education Initiative website. I can go into, I'll show you a little bit of that State of Mind online exhibit worksheet. So students are just answering 2 questions that guide them through the different pages of the online exhibit itself. And you can just take a look through, and it really leads you through the entire exhibit as it exists. And again, we do have past exhibits up there as well from the past several years, not just the past, you know, 2 or 3. So it's just a great way to have a field trip without the ability to travel at this time. So
is open right now. You can visit in person. Again, the hours are kind of limited. It's Wednesday through Saturday from 10 a.m. until 5:30, and you'd have to come in on a timed ticket. But if that's something you're curious about as a teacher, you want to visit and kind of see some things in person, you can email me directly and I can help arrange that visit for you. But otherwise, you can see the exhibit in its entirety online.
Thank you. So hopefully some of what I was talking about on the online exhibits came through. But again, if anybody has any questions relating to any of those online resources, please let me know.
Yeah, and we definitely want to, I know Brittany touched on this, build up more of our offerings from teachers. Please, if you are interested in submitting a lesson plan, check out that website, the Bicentennial Education Initiative. It's part of Maine Memory Network. This doesn't have to be something that you're creating from right now from scratch. It might be, I've already got a great lesson on this topic. I'd love to share it. And we can kind of help you refine it and get it edited so it'll be, you know, appropriate to include on the website. We do for every submission that we get each month, we enter it into a pool, into a drawing, and you could win a $400 stipend for your classroom. It's a bicentennial education initiative, but the lessons do not need to be about the bicentennial. They do not need to be about statehood, really anything about Maine. It doesn't even have to be a social studies lesson. Like Brittany was saying, that her sports lesson looks a lot at physical education. We've got some science and art lessons up there. So please consider it. If you have colleagues that you think might be interested, share that information. We're also happy to get lessons from retired teachers, from librarians. You don't have to be currently a classroom teacher. This is a real community project that we're hoping more and more people will want to join in on.
Kathleen and Brittany, you have a question in the chat. If you have any information or specific resources available related to the impact of the pandemic in 1918 and 1919.
So we do have some, and I'll let Brittany answer this question too, because she's done some lesson plans on this. We have some, we don't have a ton of collections. There are a couple things you can see on Maine Memory Network. I know specifically there's a photograph of a man just sort of like stopping by his storefront and looking into the window, and there's a sign about the pandemic in the window. There were also a couple of letters that were written by a soldier. His last name was Cobb. He was a soldier during World War I, as were two of his brothers. And this particular soldier never made it like overseas. Like I don't think he ever made it like out of the training camps before the war was over. But he talks about how it's affected like the people that are in his training camp. He mentions the influenza specifically. Brittany, do you want to talk to that a little bit more?
Sure, yeah. Yeah, we also do have a few other resources within that Maine healthcare history lesson plan that I had shown. It's on the home lesson plan page on Maine Memory Network. There is a fair amount of information in there too. We also have a whole site page on Mercy Hospital, which was founded kind of right during the influenza pandemic in 1918, since they saw that there was so much of a greater need for healthcare in Portland specifically at that time. So that's a great resource as well. Looking into that site page. I know we also have one video on Maine Memory Network of our director, Steve Bromage, in conversation with a doctor about the influenza pandemic. So that should be available. I can find.
Brittany, I can put that link up in the chat. Yeah, that's on our past programs page. I'm glad you remembered that. Yep, you can see that on that's not on Maine Memory Network, it's on our organization's website, but yeah, that's a good, that was a good program too. And we've been working, I know some of you participated earlier this week, Brittany and I have been working with the Maine State Museum and Maine State Archives and Library on kind of coming together with the primary sources that we all have on the topic of pandemics. And we're starting to pilot some of those tools that we're creating for teachers on using primary sources to talk about this subject. So be looking for those through that collaboration soon. Anybody else have any other questions? Thank you.
Thanks, Brittany, so much. Feel free to put questions in the chat, everybody. And I just wanted to give you an overview of the rest of our session together, just so you can plan, because there's a bonus option at the end. So after our next short break, we will be going into a session with Renee Keul from the Osher Map Library about finding and using maps of Maine in your classroom. And then at 1 o'clock, we will have an option for optional breakout rooms with each organization. So Chris and Endawnis from Akomawt will stay. Renee will stay for Osher Map Library. And we will also have our Maine Historical Society friends. So this is not a required option, nor will it be part of a recorded option. It's available to you if you have some follow-up questions from anyone from these organizations that you want to know a little bit more about. So what I will ask, and I will ask again when we come back from break, if you want to send me a message in the chat, Libby Bischoff, if you want to stay for a breakout and which group you would like to go in, I'm going to pre-format the breakout rooms. So at 1 p.m., I can send you right into the breakout rooms with whoever you might want to chat with. And again, completely up to you. So if during the break or after the break, you want to just send me a little private note in the chat, you can just select my name and you can just say the breakout session you would like to go again. Heidi, I am happy to repeat them. So either a breakout room with Maine Historical, with the Osher Map Library, or with Endawnis and Chris from Akomawt. And this is not to say you can't follow up with any of us individually, but if you want a chance to just ask a couple follow-up questions related to our individual presentations, or using maps or using primary sources on the Maine Memory Network, more about what Akomawt does and their work in classrooms and some of their resources, we just wanted to give people that option at 1 o'clock. So I'm going to prearrange that so it can be as seamless as possible. So if you just want to send me that note, that's great. And if you don't want to be in any breakout room, don't worry about it, and do not send me a note, no problem. So we're going to take just a quick 15-minute break. We'll start right at 12:15 with Renee's presentation on finding maps of Maine. So we'll see everybody in just a minute.
That's a lot easier. Okay. And if you can't log in, you can just follow along on the main screen share on Zoom. That's fine. All right. So can everyone see that okay? Can I get a thumbs up? All right, perfect. So I'm going to start this off with a quote by Burl Markham in her 1942 memoir. And what she says is, "A map says to you, read me carefully, follow me closely, doubt me not." And as Beryl clearly learned, maps should be doubted. And that's especially true when it comes to using historic maps as primary sources. So students who have not used historic maps as primary sources before often approach them as if they're completely true, which of course they are not. One of the most important things that students need to learn about historic maps is that they are not impervious to their makers' worldviews. So they're full of biases and errors. And especially when using historic maps of Maine or the United States, the vast majority of those maps that are available to us show a colonizer perspective, which is something we need to be aware of when we're using them. So let's do a little exercise. I want us to take a good look at the map to the right of our screens. If you weren't able to join Pear Deck for any reason, you can go to oshermaps.org/map/11891, and that link is also on the main screen share. And from there, I want us to consider, if a student was given this map without any context, what are a few things they might believe about Maine in 1839, whether true or not true? And we'll just take a minute to look. All right, so let's move on. And I would love to hear from you folks what you found. So if a student was given this map without any context, what is something they might believe about Maine in 1839? And you can just choose one of the things that occurred to you when you were looking.
Maybe it's just me, but I have a little bit more time because navigating and trying to zoom in was.
Absolutely, yes. Thank you for that feedback. So next time I'll make sure to give us a little bit more time. I'll even set my timer on my phone to make sure that what feels like a minute to me is actually a minute.
I have the map. What do I do?
So right now you're just kind of thinking about what a student might believe about Maine in 1839 from looking at this map. And here are some of the responses. I'm putting them up on the main screen share that other people have come up with. So one thing we're finding, you might believe that it's easy to get around Maine by waterway. The northern boundary is different from what we understand today. Absolutely.
Yeah, that's what I was in Maine, and I was in Maine a couple years back. Most of the people say it's near the border of the Canada, so
right.
it made me think that it's part of like Canada, and yeah, and also I know that it is like the coldest place ever in Maine. The second place beside the other, I can't remember the name, the other one. The other place that is the very cold Antarctic.
Right. So like Canada, yeah.
There's another state, I can't remember what's the name.
Oh, probably Alaska, right?
Yeah, Alaska. Yes.
Yeah.
It's beautiful. It's really beautiful place.
It is, yeah. And it does look like a lot of us are seeing that Maine is kind of cut in half. It looks like Maine was, the top part of Maine was part of Canada at this time. And let's actually.
Yeah, because they just like drive through the border and go to Canada and come back.
Right, right. And it is important that students understand that maps show the map maker's point of view. So the map that we just looked at was from a British perspective. And the map that we're going to look at now was made by an American during the same time period. So once again, take a close look at the map and identify a difference between this American depiction of Maine and the previous British depiction of Maine. Once again, if you weren't able to go onto Pear Deck, you can go to the link on the share screen, which is oshermaps.org/map/50-92. And so once again, what we're considering is what is something in this depiction of Maine that contradicts the previous map. And I will set my timer on my phone so that I know.
Oh, the other. My line just cut off.
Oh, I think
sorry.
We're hearing you okay.
Okay. The other map is the current one.
Yeah.
Okay. 50292.
Exactly. All right. So let's move on here. So now I would love it if we could once again take a minute to just share what we found. So you can go ahead and type in one of the differences that you identified. All right, we can kind of take a look at what our fellow attendees are saying. So one thing that I'm noticing is once again the border, right? The northern border is much further into Canada. We have, yep, it's the time before the Webster-Ashburton Treaty. Absolutely. So we're all kind of on the same wavelength there for the most part. And yes, the most obvious difference between the two maps is the northern border of Maine. And this map that I'm showing you right now helps to contextualize the two previous maps. And as many of you know, there was a boundary dispute between Great Britain and the United States during the 1830s and early 40s. The Treaty of Paris, which was made at the end of the Revolutionary War, identified the border between Canada, which was then a dominion of Great Britain, and Maine as the Highlands. And obviously that is a bit vague. So the British claimed that the highlands that marked the border started at Mars Hill in the east and stretched west below the Aroostook River and its tributaries, where the Americans claimed that the highlands referred to a stretch of high elevation much further north. And this boundary dispute is called the Aroostook War, even though there were no real battles fought before a compromise line was decided on by, as someone mentioned, the British Lord Ashburton and the American Daniel Webster. And they came to that compromise in 1842. But this 1839 map shows the borders claimed by both sides, as well as a rejected compromise line proposed by the King of the Netherlands, who was acting as a neutral party. And the important point is that by looking at multiple perspectives, we get a more complete picture of what is happening in Maine during this time. Now, unfortunately, when using historic maps of Maine or the United States, the vast majority of the maps that are available to us show a colonizer perspective. And since we want to get the most complete picture possible by incorporating multiple viewpoints, we need to find a way to include the perspectives of Indigenous peoples in Maine. And at this point in the workshop, utilizing Indigenous place names as primary sources is well-trodden territory. But I do just want to make sure everybody knows about the Wabanaki place names map that is available on Bates College website. It was created actually by students of Donald Sochtema and Micah Pauling, who are members, I believe, of the Penobscot community, and they actually were teaching a class, and they got their students involved in making this Wabanaki place names map. So hopefully everyone's able to see it. And you can kind of just explore it for a quick few seconds. It's pretty great and something you can share with your students as well. Another resource that really great resource that I've begun to recommend as pre-teaching for our Maine Maps field trip is a lesson plan made by the educators at the Abe Museum about Penobscot and Passamaquoddy birch bark maps. Because it gives us some great examples of historic maps made from an indigenous perspective, and it shows a very different way of looking at the land than we see in the colonizer maps. So these are a few of the maps that their lesson uses. Obviously, it would be ideal to see these in their original birch bark form, but since that is not an option in these particular cases, the educators at the Abe use these map recreations from an annual report of the Bureau of Ethnology to the Smithsonian. And this is from the late 19th century. And in the report, you can actually read an explanation of these maps. So I want to give us the opportunity to take a minute to silently read the description about this Penobscot map. It's labeled figure 449. If you're reading on the archive.org webpage to the right, there are two magnifying glasses in the lower right-hand corner that allow you to zoom in and out. And for the rest of you, if you are not on Pear Deck, I'm just going to quickly put this link into the chat. Or I'm going to try to anyway. All right, so hopefully we've had a chance to kind of read through that. So let's just take a quick minute to share some thoughts about this map. Is there anything that sticks out to you in particular, or if you prefer a more directed question, what is a way this perspective of the land differs from the maps that we've seen made by colonizers? And you can go ahead and type your ideas if you're comfortable sharing, either in this text box or in the chat. And we can kind of check in on what others are thinking and feeling about this. All right, and we're getting a lot of great responses here. So it's showing the parts they needed to know. It relies on geographical landmarks and descriptors. Yeah, it really provides some information on natural resources and fauna. Absolutely. Right, right. So it's not delineating ownership. It's not carving up the land into different man-made political sections. It's really more about sharing the land and how to navigate it. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, great. So now I'm going to switch tacks a little bit here, and I want to talk about where to find historic maps online. So these are just a very few. There are so many more, but I want to just highlight a couple. And of course, I'm going to start by looking at Osher Map Library's website at oshermaps.org. So when you go to the homepage, you'll see our basic search box underneath the menu at the left, on the left, unless you're on a very narrow screen, in which case you'll have to click the 3 horizontal lines at the top right to expand that menu bar. And the basic search is not a bad place to start. So for example, when I go in to type Westbrook, Maine, which is where I live, let's go ahead and see what happens there. So this is what the results page looks like. And you can see scrolling through that we have a few options. I'm going to actually choose the very first map, which is a map of Cumberland County from the mid-19th century. And we have several wall maps of counties in our collections, and they're great resources because they provide a lot of detail and can really help students make a connection with a place that they are familiar with. So let's go ahead and look closer at this map. So for example, I can zoom in so close on this map that I can find the house closest in 1854 to where I live now. And it belonged to someone named R. Small. So I even have a name to go with this location that I'm familiar with. So just take a few seconds, not very long, to explore this map. And do notice the inset maps along the edges, which go into even greater detail of notable towns and villages, which are pretty neat themselves. All right, so let's move on here. I mean, we could spend a long time looking at these maps because there's so much to look at. So we have actually 5 of these big county wall maps digitized. We also have a Franklin County map that isn't digitized on our site yet, but the exact, but a different copy of the same map is available on archives.maingenealogy.net. So I've included that link at the bottom as well. And you know, just within these 6 maps, probably a lot of us could find our hometowns where we teach on these, so we can really make a connection with places that we're familiar with. And the other thing I want to show you is the advanced search. So underneath the basic search bar is the link for advanced search. And if you're not finding what you're looking for right away in the basic search, this is the way to go because it will give you much more relevant results. I mean, just a disclaimer, you will likely get some randoms in the mix, but you'll get a lot less. So go ahead and click on advanced search if you're able to, and then click on the more button at the bottom and scroll all the way to the bottom where you find a checkbox labeled show only results with images. This will cut out all of the records that haven't been digitized yet. So this is a great box to check. And another important option, which is up towards the top, is the production dates. So let's say we want to find maps of Maine produced between statehood in 1820 and the Civil War. So we will put in 1820 in the production date start. And since the Civil War began in 1861, we'll put 1860 as the last year we want to see results from in the production date end box. And the third option I want us to use is the region option. In that input box, we'll simply put Maine. And let's also put Maine in the title field, which will theoretically give us only results that have the word Maine in their title. And so, oops, actually this one went a bit backwards, but essentially what you should be seeing is kind of a nice list of different Maine maps that should be useful or could be useful in a classroom setting. So I also want to point out, before we move on from oshermaps.org, I do want to point out our exhibitions page. So there are a few exhibits in particular that would be of interest when you're looking for Maine resources. So not only will you get links to maps of Maine and New England by looking through these exhibitions, you will also be able to get some contextual information in the caption of those images. Another website I want to highlight is loc.gov/maps. This is especially great site for finding Sanborn fire insurance maps, which were made for, no surprise, fire insurance companies to refer to when they were insuring a new property. So these maps show an amazing amount of detail. Your students will be able to see what buildings stood in your town a century ago, what those buildings were made of, what kind of business the buildings held, and so on. For example, looking at my town of Westbrook, there are several Sanborn fire insurance maps options. And if you're familiar at all with downtown Westbrook, you might recognize this piece of land next to the Presumpscot River as the location of Portland Pie Company, Legends Rest, Fajita Grill, Frog and Turtle, and the boardwalk as well. So this particular map is dated 1922, and evidently 100 years ago, this was quite the place to go after a long day at the mill. There's pool rooms, restaurants, even a bowling alley. And because I have multiple Sanborn map options for Westbrook, I can actually compare a few to see how things changed. Apparently in 1895, this location wasn't quite as happening as it was in 1922, but there were still a few bakeries, tobacconists, and even an intriguing business labeled Millie's Fancy Gas, whatever that is. The third site I'm going to highlight very briefly is davidrumsey.com. And this has a lot of maps in general and happens to have a lot of Maine maps too. And I'll give you just a few seconds to scroll down through and get an idea of what is available. And this is, of course, something that you can look further into on your own as well after the presentation. You can probably spend a long time just going through the maps on all three of these sites. There's a lot there. So now that we've talked about where to find maps to build your map sets, let's talk a little bit about specific activities you can do with them. So I've included a link here to my own go-to map set for Maine history. So feel free to scroll through for a minute. But I'd also like you to take a look at the primary source analysis worksheet, which is linked on this page towards the top. So you'll just find that link that says primary source analysis worksheet. This is a really great tool, especially for high school seniors who will be going off to college soon, to practice with and get familiar with. It's a worksheet based off one of the worksheets available on loc.gov and actually archives.org too, I believe. And it includes a lot of prompts that will help students tease out some details that they might not have noticed on their own. I find it personally pretty helpful if I'm looking at a new map. You can also take a quick look at some sample discussion questions that I've made. which are meant to be used with this specific map set, but could easily be adapted for your own map sets. And the last two examples I have listed here, we're actually going to do together. These are great for younger and middle grade students, but also could be useful for high school as well in some situations. So let's move on and see an example of the scavenger hunt. And this is a good way, as I said, to sneak vocab in. So this is a fun way to get students looking very closely at a map. And for example, most young students, in terms of looking at this as a way to sneak in vocab, this really is a good way to do that. And you know, most young students aren't going to know what a paddle wheel steamboat is, but you can use this opportunity to explain it to them. So let's take a minute and try to find as many of these as you're able to on this map. And just so you know, not all of these are on the map, but you can take a minute to just zoom in really closely, look around, try and find these. And you will be getting a copy of this slideshow later, so that some of these links where we're going a little bit faster to get through them, you can have an opportunity to look longer, maybe look a little bit more closely on your own. All right. Would anyone be furious if I moved on at this point? All right, no one's speaking up, so we're gonna jump ahead. And I'm curious, how many of those were you able to find? So you can go ahead, and if you're on Pear Deck, you can actually put in the number that you were able to find, and we'll be able to see what the consensus was. Oh, nice. All right, so I'll show these responses here. We're getting, oh man, someone found 18. That's a lot. It shouldn't be 18, but yeah. All right, great. So we've been finding quite a few. Someone found 2,000. Love it. So the answer, the ones I was able to find anyway, we have a moose at the bottom in a hunting scene featuring Indigenous hunters and snowshoes. There is a paddle wheel steamboat in the top left-hand corner in the view of Bangor, and there is a lumberjack in the image at the top right-hand corner. So this is an example of the last thing I mentioned in that list, the search question. And for this, you'll design questions that require students to look closely at the map in order to find the answer. And you can really design these questions to be more or less difficult depending on the skill level of your students. But let's go ahead and take a minute to find the answer to this question. The answer is somewhere on the map. And I'm going to set my timer again so I actually do exactly a minute. All right, and that is a minute. So what did we find? And we are getting a lot of the right answers here. That's great. And yes, yes. So the answer can be found in the title. And I especially love this particular question because it's a great reminder to students, and it's a reminder I need sometimes too, to pay attention to the map title. So historic maps often have very long and descriptive titles, and that can be helpful in just helping us understand what we're looking at. And so according to the title on this map, the resorts are in the coast, lake, and mountain regions. And obviously what those regions have in common is a cool breeze. And in a time before air conditioning, this was particularly valuable. Also during this time period, northern city dwellers who could afford to often left the city during the summers and kind of like decamped to northern New England for the entire season, which makes sense. Cities during the summer weren't very healthy places. So in addition to the heat and the crowding, a lot of inner city transportation still happened by horsepower, and horses leave a little something behind them. So the situation was kind of snowy and germy and just not a place you wanted to be. So what I would love, if anyone is comfortable sharing, I would love to give us a chance to share some ideas and resources. So if you have used historic maps in your classroom in different ways than we've discussed, or if you have other sites that you find useful and you feel comfortable sharing those, could you just type them either into this page or into the chat? And if you would prefer to speak out loud, you are welcome to unmute yourself to share as well. Great, great. So we have someone who mentions that they've done kind of similar to this, and they've done a lot of notice and wonder to generate questions for follow-up research with these maps for their students. Great. All right, so we have about 5 minutes left. I'm going to go ahead and just end the presentation. And we are going to I'm going to come back on video. I'm going to try to, there I am, there's the video. All right, hi everyone. So do we have any questions? You can feel free to unmute yourself and ask, or you can just type it in the chat if that's something you prefer. I'll give you a few seconds to collect your thoughts.
A question I have, none of the maps you showed were very heavily cursive type things, but do you have some sort of resource at Osher that sort of does some translation, different styles of handwriting?
That's a great question. And cursive has definitely been something that has been a big factor in my work with the students. You know, obviously a lot of them really can't read it that well. One thing that I usually need to point out pretty quickly is that what looks like an F on these really old maps are actually S's. That's the way they were made. So we get a lot of kids that are like, Brunswick, what? And then they think it's really funny. But we figure it out. And a lot of times with those maps, it really does take just them asking and me being like, okay, this is what it actually says. Or if we talk about the map, I'll kind of explain, this is what this says.
Yeah, I was just wondering if there was some sort of cheat sheet?
We should have one. We should have one. They have to exist somewhere.
There is a little bit. I curated an exhibit called Mapping the Classroom last year, and it also includes some handwriting manuals, which does break down some of the fonts that are used on the older maps. So I would be happy to share some of those with you. And if you look at our online exhibits, there's some discussion of those maps on there too. For a lot of students, especially young women in the early 1800s up through the mid 19th century, map making was not as much about geography actually as classroom exercise as it was learning handwriting and penmanship. So that's one way I've connected the students to that. And we actually did some penmanship workshops, and when we have art students come in and work with other students on map making, we also do some of this work. So there's a lot of penmanship manuals that break some of those fonts down. So I'd be happy to share those.
Great, thank you.
All right. I mean, it is just about 1. Do we want to go ahead and start the breakout rooms?
Yeah, I think by way of wrapping up, because everybody won't join us, my apologies. We lost all phones and all internet hardwire connections at the Portland campus in the middle of this webinar. So we're here. But I really want to take a moment before we go into breakout rooms just to thank all our presenters today, to thank endawnis and Chris, to thank Kathleen and Brittany, and obviously to thank Renee for coming together to share these resources, and also to thank all of you for taking the time. This is such a hard time of year. Usually it's an exciting time of prepping and getting ready, and a wonderful time to get teachers involved in some new resources. But we understand that this year is harder than anyone before it for all of us as well. And we appreciate your patience in that and your willingness. And so we will absolutely follow up by email with a list of resources, with certificates of attendance, with anything that you need to make this easier for you. And for anyone who wants to stay on to go into breakout rooms, I know there are a few of you, please feel free to do that, and we will arrange that momentarily. And if you are logging off, we also just really appreciate you being with us this afternoon on behalf of all the presenters.